She had 18 months, a false name, and a plan that should have worked forever until the night her son stopped breathing, and the only person on earth who could save him was the man she'd risked everything to disappear from. She had run from the most dangerous man in Greece. She had hidden his child, erased her name, rebuilt herself from nothing in a city that swallowed secrets whole. She had been so careful, so certain, so completely catastrophically wrong because no plan survives a mother watching her child die, and no amount of fear is stronger than love. She picked up the phone. She dialed the number she'd sworn she would never dial. And Nicholas Drakos answered on the second ring. If you want to see how far love can survive betrayal, sacrifice, and the shadows of the Greek underworld, stay until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. The apartment had been quiet for 11 minutes. Sera Voss knew this because she'd been counting. Not deliberately, she was a trauma nurse, her brain wired for intervals and baselines and the clinical measurement of time, but because the silence had weight to it, the kind that pressed against the eardrums and made the hairs rise along the back of the neck. Before the silence, 3 hours of crying. High, inconsolable, the kind that brought concerned knocks from the woman in 3A, and made Sera pace the narrow corridor of the apartment with Theo pressed against her shoulder, his small body radiating heat like a coal. The crying had stopped at 11:47 p.m. She'd felt the change before she understood it. Theo, going still in her arms with a heaviness that wasn't sleep, his head lolling back against her collarbone, his breathing changed, shallow, labored, the soft, stuttering rhythm of a body working too hard to keep itself going. Sera set him on the couch and assessed him the way she'd assessed 1,000 patients. Pupils, color, responsiveness, work of breathing. The assessment took 45 seconds and told her everything she didn't want to know. Temperature 105.4. Respiratory rate 32. Fast. Too fast for a child this size. Skin hot, flushed, mottled at the extremities in a way that had nothing to do with the room temperature. He was 18 months old. He weighed 22 pounds. And the clinic had told her twice tonight to give him paracetamol, keep him hydrated, bring him in if it got worse. It had gotten worse. Theo. She pressed her palm to his cheek, gentle, watching his eyes. They fluttered, not the bright, irritated flutter of a child fighting sleep, but something slower, more effortful, like a signal going in and out. Hey, stay with me. He didn't respond. Sera pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and made herself breathe. She was good at this, at standing in the storm and thinking clearly, at finding the clinical distance that turned chaos into protocol. She'd worked 3 years in a Thessaloniki trauma bay. She'd held the hands of people who didn't survive. She knew how to be the calm one. She had never been the calm one about this. Her phone was on the kitchen counter. She crossed to it in 3 steps, unlocked it, and stood there with her thumb hovering over the screen. An ambulance would take 20 minutes and require documentation. Documentation meant her real name. Her real name meant a chain of inquiries that would eventually, inevitably lead back to where she'd come from, and when that chain was followed, Theo would be the one who paid for it. She'd had this calculus memorized for 18 months. She'd rehearsed it in the dark while Theo slept in his second-hand crib in the corner. She'd told herself she had it handled, every contingency covered, every scenario mapped. She had not mapped for this. From the couch, Theo made a sound. Not a cry. Something smaller and worse than a cry, a soft exhalation that didn't quite become an intake of breath, a pause at the bottom of it that lasted a half-second too long. Sera's hand moved without her permission. She scrolled to the bottom of her contacts, past the fake names, the burner numbers, the carefully cultivated network of people who only knew her as Sera Voss, the quiet nurse who paid her rent on time and didn't ask questions. At the very bottom, under a contact she'd saved 18 months ago and opened perhaps 100 times without pressing call, was a number she'd never been able to make herself delete. No name, just a number. Just 10 digits that represented the single most dangerous decision she'd ever made. She pressed call. It rang twice. Speak! The voice was low, controlled, edged with the particular authority of someone who had not been surprised in a very long time. Deep, precise, familiar in the way that things you've tried to forget are always familiar, immediately, viscerally, the sound of it reaching past every wall she'd built and landing somewhere undefended. Nicholas? Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Barely. Silence. Then quieter. Sera. Not a question. She'd expected a question, expected surprise, disbelief, the recalibration of someone hearing a ghost. Instead, she got her name in his mouth, 2 syllables the way he'd always said it, like it was a thing he was deciding to keep. I need your help. She watched Theo's chest. Rose, fell, paused. My son is sick. He has a fever 105 going higher, and he's... Her voice broke on the last word. She swallowed it. He's not responding. I need a doctor. A real one tonight, no questions. Silence again. Longer. She could hear him thinking the quality of his quiet was different from other people's, denser, like a room with all the furniture pushed against the walls to make space for something specific. Where are you? He said, not a question. It doesn't matter. It does. His voice sharpened, not loud. It never needed to be loud. Where are you, Sera? She closed her eyes. Theo's chest rose, fell, paused. Athens, Kipsley District, apartment 4B18 Alkaios Street. She opened her eyes. He needs a doctor in the next hour. Nicholas? That's all I'm asking. Send a doctor and I'll be there in 20 minutes. A pause. Don't open the door for anyone except me. Don't call anyone else. And Sera. The way he said her name changed, still quiet, still controlled, but something below it, something that had no business being there after 18 months of silence. If you disappear before I arrive, I will take this city apart looking for you. We are past that now. Do you understand me? The line went dead. Sera stood in the kitchen of her third apartment in 18 months, her phone still pressed against her ear, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her back teeth. She looked at Theo. His chest rose, fell. She set the phone down and went to sit beside him on the couch. Okay, she whispered to him or to herself. Okay. She had made the only choice available to her. Now she had to survive it. Nicholas Drakos was not a man who ran. He'd learned early that running communicated fear, and fear was a currency you couldn't afford to spend in the world he moved through. He walked. He thought. He arrived at destinations with the particular calm of someone who had already decided what would happen next and was simply waiting for events to confirm it. He crossed the distance between his study window and his office door in 4 seconds. His head of security. Petros was already in the corridor, a compact man in his mid-40s with watchful eyes and the kind of stillness that came from years of absorbing information and releasing none of it. He'd been with Nicholas since the beginning. He had on more than one occasion been the reason Nicholas was still alive. Cars. Nicholas kept moving. Full detail. Kipseli District. Now. Petros didn't ask questions. He disappeared. By the time Nicholas reached the lobby, 2 armored vehicles were waiting at the base of the steps with engines running. He got into the rear vehicle, closed the door, and allowed himself exactly 1 moment of stillness. 18 months. 18 months of searching, of following leads that evaporated and trails that doubled back on themselves, of deploying resources across a city that should have been incapable of concealing anything from him. He had people in hospitals, in municipal records, in every neighborhood, administration in Greater Athens. He'd had her photograph distributed to a network that covered the Aegean coast. He had found nothing because Sera Voss had been trained in her time with him to understand exactly how he looked for people, and she had used that knowledge against him with devastating precision. She'd been thorough, professional. She'd learned the shape of his methods and inverted them. He should be furious. He was furious. He was also something else, something he didn't permit himself to examine too closely, something that felt like a long-held breath finally released. The convoy moved through Athens at speed, the driver navigating with the quiet competence of someone who understood that hesitation had costs. Nicholas sat with his hands flat on his knees and watched the city slide past the neighborhoods thinning from glass and marble to older concrete, the streets narrowing, the lighting growing sparse. Kipseli. He knew it by reputation only. It was not the kind of district he had reason to visit. It was the kind of district where a woman could disappear. The building on Alkaios Street was indistinguishable from the 6 others on the block, 5 stories of poured concrete and rusted balcony railings. Laundry lines stretched between windows, a broken streetlight casting the entrance in amber shadow. Nicholas stepped out of the vehicle and stood for a moment looking at it. This was where she'd been. This was what she'd chosen. He signaled to Petros' perimeter, no one in or out, and climbed the stairs alone. The stairwell smelled of damp concrete and cooking oil. Somewhere above him, a television played. He counted flights the way he always counted things, automatically assembling data from every sensory input, the scuff marks on the walls, the frequency of locks on doors, the way sound carried in the building. By the time he reached the fourth floor, he had a complete picture of the structure's weaknesses, most of which were structural. Apartment 4B. The door was scratched around the lock, not forced entry, just where the kind that accumulated when someone didn't have money to replace hardware. He raised his hand and knocked twice. The door opened immediately. She'd been standing at it waiting. For a half-second, Nicholas Drakos, a man who had not been unprepared for anything in 15 years, had nothing. Sera stood in the doorway in dark jeans and an oversized gray shirt, her dark hair pulled back, her face stripped of everything except fear and exhaustion and the specific terrible alertness of someone who has been running on adrenaline for too long. She was thinner than he remembered. The angles of her face were sharper, her eyes dark brown, always reading, always assessing, moved over him with the nurse's efficiency, taking inventory. Then he saw what she was holding. The child. A boy. Small, the size of children, never failed to catch Nicholas off guard, the sheer smallness of them with dark curls damp against his forehead and a flush of fever color along his cheekbones. He was limp in Sera's arms in the way that meant something was wrong, not a sleep limp, but heavy, the loose weight of a body that had stopped fighting. Nicholas registered the dark curls, the shape of the jaw, the way the boy's brows drew together even in stillness. He registered the math. 18 months. He needs a doctor right now, Sera said. Her voice was controlled, but her hands were shaking. Nicholas, please. He stepped back from what was trying to happen in his chest and spoke. Get in the car. She didn't argue. That told him everything. She grabbed a bag from inside the door, one bag small, the bag of someone accustomed to leaving quickly, and carried the boy down the stairs. Nicholas walked behind her, one hand at her back, not touching, not quite. Petros held the vehicle door. Nicholas helped her in without ceremony and climbed in opposite. Dr. Andreu, he said to Petros as the door closed, tell him to meet us at the estate in 30 minutes. Full medical setup, pediatric. Petros made the call. Nicholas turned back to the car's interior. Sera sat with the boy in her arms, rocking slightly, murmuring something low and continuous against his hair. The boy's breathing was shallow but present. His skin looked terrible in the vehicle's interior lighting, hot mottled wrong. His name, Nicholas said. Sera's arms tightened. Theo. Nicholas held the name in his mind for a moment. How old? She didn't answer. Sera. He kept his voice even. How old is he? Her jaw worked. In the passing light of the city, he watched something move through her expression. Grief, maybe, or the particular agony of someone who has been holding a secret so long that releasing it feels like injury. 18 months. The convoy moved through Athens. Nicholas looked at the boy, at the dark curls and the jaw, and the way his brows drew together so precisely, like looking in a mirror, that it took his breath away in a way nothing had taken his breath in years. When were you going to tell me? He said. Sera's eyes closed. I don't know. That's not an answer. I know it's not. She opened her eyes and looked at him directly, which took courage he found himself noting despite himself. I was afraid. Of me. Of your world. Of what it would mean for him growing up inside it. Being used because of it. I watched you come home bleeding, Nicholas. I watched you make decisions about people's lives like they were entries in a ledger. I was pregnant and alone and terrified, and I made a choice to protect my son. Our son. The words landed in the car with the force of something physical. Sera looked away. Our son, Nicholas repeated quieter this time, something underneath the word that hadn't been there before. The estate gates opened as the convoy approached. Nicholas looked at the boy at Theo the whole way up the drive. Dr. Andreu was 63, white-haired, and had been treating the Drakos family's various emergencies for 20 years without ever asking a question he didn't need the answer to. He met them in the foyer with a medical bag and the efficient calm of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by what the Drakos household required. Upstairs, Nicholas said. East wing, the blue room. A crib had been set up. Nicholas had made that call from the car, one text, 3 words, and by the time they arrived, it was done. Sera stopped in the doorway when she saw it, something passing through her expression too quickly for him to read. You made one call, she said. Yes. She carried Theo to the crib and laid him down, and Andreu was already beside her, stethoscope out, hands moving with practiced precision over the boy's chest. Talk to me, Andreu said to Sera, and she shifted immediately. The fear didn't go away. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, but something professional surfaced alongside it, and she gave the doctor a textbook-precise summary: fever, onset timeline, respiratory presentation. what she'd already tried. Andreu listened without interrupting. Then, IV fluids. I want to bring this temperature down before we talk about anything else. If he doesn't improve in 3 hours, he goes to a hospital. No hospitals, Nicholas said from the doorway. Andreu looked at him. Handle it here. The doctor paused for one beat, then nodded. He reached into his bag. Sera stayed by the crib, one hand through the rails, touching Theo's arm, murmuring to him in the low, continuous voice of a mother who has run out of everything except presence. Nicholas stayed in the doorway and watched the doctor work the IV, going in with smooth efficiency the medication administered the temperature monitor attached. Andreu straightened after 20 minutes. He's stable. The fever needs to break, but I'm cautiously optimistic. I'll stay the night. He left them alone. Sera sank into the chair beside the crib as if her legs had simply decided they were done. She folded forward, her elbows on her knees, her face in her hands, and her shoulders shook with something she was clearly trying to keep silent. Nicholas crossed the room. He didn't touch her. He stood beside her for a moment, looking at Theo, at the small chest rising and falling, steadier now, more reliable. And then he pulled a second chair from the corner of the room and sat. "Tell me," he said quietly. She looked up. Her eyes were red. "Everything," he said. "Start with the night you left. The city outside was dark, and the house was quiet, and Sera Voss, who had been running for 18 months from the man sitting 3 feet away from her, took a slow breath and began to talk. She'd been 3 months pregnant when she left. She hadn't known it yet. The tests had come after in a clinic outside Thessaloniki, where she'd given a false name and paid in cash and sat alone in a beige waiting room while the world as she'd understood it rearranged itself permanently. She'd made the decision before she saw the results. She'd already been leaving. The pregnancy had simply confirmed it. "You were at war," she said. "The Vassos family was pushing. People were dying. I watched you come home covered in blood 3 times in 2 months. And I watched you make decisions about where the bodies went, and I realized..." She stopped. "I realized that I'd stopped being afraid of you personally, and that somehow that was more terrifying, because it meant I was getting comfortable with things I had no business being comfortable with." Nicholas said nothing. "I left because I was in love with you," Sera said. The words came out flat factual, like something she'd rehearsed until it lost its charge. "And I couldn't figure out how to love you and keep a child safe inside your world at the same time. So I chose the child." Nicholas stood. He paced to the window, his hands in his pockets, his back to her. "I searched for you for 8 months. I know. I thought..." He stopped. His jaw tightened. "I thought you were dead. It was easier to believe that than to believe you'd chosen to leave. I'm sorry. Don't." He turned. His expression was controlled, but his eyes were not. "Don't apologize for it. You made a decision about your survival and your child's survival. I can understand that. What I cannot understand, what I am working very hard not to say things about right now, is that he is my son. And you made that decision without me." Sera held his gaze. "I know. I had a right to know he existed. I know. And you're not going to give me a satisfying reason because there isn't one." His voice was very quiet. "There's only what you did and the fact that he's here now and alive because you called me, which means we start from this." Sera nodded slowly. "From this." Nicholas looked at Theo. The boy's color was better already, the modeling fading, his breathing slower and more even. Andreu had said cautiously optimistic. Nicholas filed that phrase and set it aside. "You're not leaving," he said, "tonight or otherwise, until I know you're both safe." Sera opened her mouth. "That's not a threat," he said. "That's a fact. The Vassos family, Leonidas Vassos, specifically has been watching my movements for the past 6 weeks. If he learns that I have a son, Sera, if he learns that you exist, and what you are to me, you become a target, both of you. That's not a hypothetical. That's how this world works." Sera was quiet for a long time. "I know how your world works," she finally said. "Then you know I'm not wrong." She looked at Theo. At his dark curls spread against the white pillow of the crib, at the small hand curled near his chin, at the IV taped carefully to the inside of his elbow. "I know you're not wrong," she said. Nicholas sat back down. The house settled around them, the quiet of a large building at night, the hum of distant security equipment, the soft beep of Theo's monitor. They sat without speaking for a while, 2 people in a room with a child between them, and Nicholas looked at his son for the first time and felt something in the architecture of himself shift, some load-bearing wall that had been standing for 37 years, making way for something new. The fever broke at 3 in the morning. Theo's temperature dropped in stages 105 to 103, then to 101, then to 99.4 as the dawn light began to seep around the curtain edges. Sera had not slept. Nicholas had not slept either, though he'd spent an hour in the corridor giving Petros instructions about the perimeter and another half-hour on a call he hadn't told Sera about regarding Leonidas Vassos. He came back to the room at 5 a.m. to find Sera still in the chair, eyes open, watching Theo breathe with the focused intensity of someone counting everyone. "He's better," Nicholas said. "I know." She didn't look away from the crib. "I can tell from the color, and his breathing is normal." A pause. "Thank you." Nicholas pulled the other chair around so he was sitting beside her rather than across from her. They both looked at Theo. "He looks like you," Sera said quietly. "He has your mouth." A startled sound from her, almost a laugh. "He has your eyebrows. He's had them since birth. These very serious, very dramatic eyebrows. They're distinguished. He's 18 months old." Something eased in Nicholas's chest, fractionally carefully. "In my family, distinguished eyebrows appear early." Another almost laugh. Shorter this time, and then she looked at him sidelong, and there was something in her expression that hadn't been there earlier. Something that was not quite the fear, and not quite the guilt, but sat between them differently. Theo stirred. Both of them leaned forward at once. The boy's eyes opened dark, fever-bright, blinking at the unfamiliar ceiling, and then he turned his head and found Sera, and his face crumpled with relief. "Mama." The word came out cracked and small and completely itself. Sera was out of the chair in an instant. She lifted him from the crib, careful of the IV, and held him against her chest. He buried his face in her neck and gripped her shirt with both fists. "I've got you," she murmured. "I've got you, sweet. Mama's here." Theo turned his head. He looked at Nicholas. Nicholas had been looked at by every category of person over the course of his career. Men who wanted things from him, men who feared him, men who were trying to deceive him. He had learned to read eyes with the precision of a surgeon, but he had never been looked at quite like this, with the uncomplicated total attention of a child who had not yet learned that the world contained anything to be wary of. Theo studied him with enormous dark eyes. Then he reached out one small hand toward Nicholas's face. Nicholas was not, he would have said before this moment, a man who could be undone by small gestures. He reached out and let Theo's hand land against his jaw. The boy's fingers were warm, slightly sticky traces of IV adhesive still on them. They pressed against Nicholas's face with a toddler's characteristic lack of coordination, patting twice, investigating. Theo looked at his mother, then back at Nicholas. Then, with the decisive pragmatism of someone who has made up his mind about something, he made a grab for Nicholas's collar. Sera's breath caught. "Here," Nicholas said, and took Theo from her arms before he quite knew he was going to do it. The boy weighed almost nothing, or everything. Nicholas had not held a child, had never had reason to, had spent his entire adult life in rooms where children were not present, and the weight of Theo against his chest was disorienting in a way that had nothing to do with the physical reality of it. Theo patted his face again. "Hey," Nicholas said quietly. Theo giggled. It was a small sound, rough around the edges from the fever, abbreviated not yet at full strength, and it landed somewhere in the center of Nicholas Drakos' chest, and did something there that he was not prepared to name, that he was not sure he could name, that had no language in the vocabulary he'd spent 37 years constructing. He looked up and found Sera watching him with tears running silently down her face. "I'm sorry," she said again. She wasn't apologizing for the same thing this time. He understood the difference. "I know," he said. He held his son while the sun came up over Athens. Outside, the city woke. Somewhere in a different part of that city, Nicholas's security team was quietly pulling all available intelligence on Leonidas Vassos. Somewhere else, the chain of events that Sera's phone call had set in motion was already moving forward. But here in this room, for this particular hour, there was only this: a woman watching a man hold his son for the first time 18 months late in the quiet after crisis, with everything still left to fight about and everything still left to build. Nicholas pressed his lips briefly to the top of Theo's head. Theo grabbed his ear. "Okay," Nicholas said. "That's mine." And despite everything, the fear and the guilt and the war waiting outside the window and the 18 months between them, that would have to be accounted for. Eventually, Sera Voss laughed. Nicholas spent the first hour after dawn in the East Corridor making calls. The calls were quiet ones, the kind that didn't leave records placed through 3 different relay systems to numbers that existed only as temporary digits in the memories of people who were paid specifically to forget them. By the time he returned to the blue room with coffee and a plate of food Sera hadn't asked for but needed, he had a clearer picture of what they were dealing with. Leonidas Vassos was asking questions, not about Theo, not yet, but about Sera. About the woman who'd worked for Nicholas 3 years ago as a private nurse, the woman who'd left without notice, the woman Nicholas had searched for with unusual and to anyone paying attention, revealing intensity. Leonidas Vassos paid very close attention to unusual things. Nicholas set the coffee on the table beside Sera and looked at Theo, who was propped against the crib pillow eating a cracker Andrew had produced from somewhere and regarding his own feet with the serious focus of a scholar contemplating a difficult text. "He's going to need to stay on the IV until early afternoon," Nicholas said. "Andreu will check him again at noon. If the fever stays down, we can take it out." Sera was watching him. She'd cleaned up while he'd been in the corridor, her hair down her face washed. She looked exhausted and something else careful. The way she looked when she was processing information she wasn't ready to react to yet. "You were on the phone," she said. "Yes?" "About us. About threats to us." "There's a distinction." He sat. "Leonidas Vassos has been a problem for some time. I handled the most recent escalation 8 months ago, a territorial dispute, a resolution that was acceptable to both parties on paper. In practice, Vassos doesn't accept resolutions. He accepts pauses." Nicholas picked up his own coffee. "He's been watching my personal movements for 6 weeks, which means he's looking for exactly this kind of leverage." Sera was very still. "He doesn't know about Theo," Nicholas continued. "Yet. But he will. These things move faster than anyone wants them to, and when the information reaches him that I have a son, that the boy's mother existed in a certain proximity to me, it will change the nature of what he thinks is available to him." He looked at her directly. "Which means we need to move you before that happens." "Move us where?" "The island compound. Off the Saronic Gulf, 40 minutes by boat. It's not visible from any major shipping lane. The perimeter is mine completely, and Vassos doesn't have the naval resources to challenge it directly." Sera put down her coffee cup. "When you say island compound, I mean what it sounds like. You mean a place from which we can't leave without your permission?" Nicholas held her gaze. "I mean a place from which you are physically protected from men who would use Theo to destroy me. Yes, it's fortified. Yes, I control access. That's the point." "The point." Her voice had an edge to it now, the first real edge since they'd arrived, and Nicholas recognized it from before, from the arguments they'd had when she'd still been working for him, the ones where she'd been the only person in his household who didn't simply agree with whatever he said. "The point is that you have a son for about 6 hours, and your immediate instinct is to lock him up. My immediate instinct is to keep him alive. Those aren't the same thing. In this context, Sera said, you are making unilateral decisions about my son's life without asking me anything. The way you make every decision. The way you've always made every decision, because you're Nicholas Drakos and you don't share authority and you don't consult anyone, and that is exactly why I left." The words fell between them with the precision of something practiced, something she'd been composing for 18 months. Nicholas was quiet for a long moment. "You left," he said finally, "because you were afraid. That's not the same as leaving because I was wrong. You were both." She didn't back down. He noted this with a complicated mixture of frustration and something that was almost admiration. "You were dangerous and you were wrong, and I was afraid of both, and the fact that the danger turns out to be real doesn't make the other part disappear. I'm not asking you to trust blindly. I'm asking you to understand the situation and make an informed choice. Then let me make one. Tell me about the island. Tell me what staying there looks like, not an order a conversation." Nicholas looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat back. "Tell me what you need to know," he said. It was for him an unusually large concession. He could tell she recognized it. What followed was an hour's conversation, the most consecutive direct communication they'd had in the 3 years he'd known her, in which Nicholas described the island facility with a specificity he didn't normally apply to explanations, and Sera asked questions he didn't normally answer, and Theo ate 3 crackers and then fell asleep again between them like a small, decisive moderator. The island had 14 permanent staff. The residential wing was a separate structure from the operations center, connected by a covered walkway but functionally independent with its own entrance and its own security. There were outdoor spaces, a garden on the southern side, protected by elevation, and sight lines, a small beach accessible by internal path. There was a medical bay. He said, no reason she would need to be in any of the parts of the facility that had anything to do with his business operations. And when it's safe, she asked, how do you define that? When Vassos is no longer a credible threat, and how long does that take? As long as it takes. He met her eyes. I know that's not what you want to hear. No. She looked at Theo. But I understand it. She didn't look happy. He didn't require that she look happy. What he needed was that she not disappear again, not with Theo, not without him. Not into another 6 months of silence, while Leonidas Vassos assembled his intelligence and identified the exact place where Nicholas Drakos was most vulnerable. I have conditions, Sera said. Of course you do. She ignored the tone. I'm involved in decisions about Theo's daily life, schedule medical care, everything. You consult me. I'm not staff. You're not staff. I work. She looked at him directly. Not immediately, but eventually. I'm a nurse. I've spent the last 18 months doing patchwork clinic work under a false name, and I need to practice real medicine. Whatever arrangement we come to has to include that. Agreed. She blinked. That was easy. It was reasonable. He watched her recalibrate. I don't disagree with everything you say. I just don't explain my reasoning out loud as often as I should. Sera studied him with the expression she used when she was trying to determine whether something was genuine or tactical. He'd seen that expression many times. It had always unsettled him more than it should have. One more condition, she said. Tell me. We're honest with each other. About the danger, about the decisions, about what this is and what it isn't. She held his gaze. I'm not your prisoner. I'm the mother of your child, and I called you because I trusted you with his life. Don't make me regret that. I won't, Nicholas. I won't, he said again, and meant it in a way he hadn't meant that particular phrase in some time. Theo stirred in the crib. His eyes opened dark and sleep-foggy, and he pushed himself upright with the effortful determination of a toddler who has decided he is done resting regardless of what his body wants. Da, Theo said, with considerable conviction, and looked directly at Nicholas. The room stopped. Sera made a small sound. Nicholas sat very still. Da, Theo said again, more confident this time, apparently pleased with the impact this was having. Nicholas reached out. His hand hovered over the crib rail for half a second. The most obvious hesitation Sera had ever seen from him. She would think later the most human one. And then he touched his son's head gently, the way you touch something you were afraid of damaging. Yeah, he said. His voice had changed. Something in it that she recognized, that she'd heard from him only rarely, that she hadn't expected to hear in a moment like this. Yeah, that's right. Theo grabbed his finger and held on. Outside the window, Athens was fully awake now. The sounds of the city building toward morning traffic, and voices, and the complicated noise of 10 million people going about their lives. Somewhere in that noise was Leonidas Vassos, paying attention to things that didn't yet know they were being watched. But for a moment in the east wing of the Drakos estate, there was only this, a man holding his son's hand for the first time, learning what it was to have something in the world that mattered more than the world. Sera sat down on the edge of the chair watching them. She'd spent 18 months making peace with her choice. She'd told herself 100 different versions of the same story, that she'd done the right thing, the brave thing, the only thing a mother with any sense would do. She'd rehearsed the arguments. She'd won every imaginary debate she'd had with herself at 2 a.m, lying on the thin mattress of whichever apartment came next, listening to Theo breathe in the corner. She hadn't imagined this. She hadn't let herself imagine this, because imagining it would have required her to admit that there was something she'd taken from Nicholas that had nothing to do with his world or his dangers or the blood she'd watched him wash off his hands. She'd taken this from him, this particular morning, this particular discovery. Theo made a triumphant noise, having successfully pulled Nicholas's finger toward his mouth. He's going to try to chew on that, Sera said. Nicholas looked at her. Something in his expression was different. Not softer exactly. That wasn't the word, but open in a way that had edges, now a quality of being seen, of not being entirely defended. Is that normal? Extremely. And I should let him. He's been doing it with everything since he got teeth. My shoulder looked terrible for a month. She paused. He bites. Nicholas looked down at his finger, currently being investigated by Theo with serious dental intent, and said nothing for a moment. Good, he said finally. Sera laughed before she could stop herself. Nicholas looked up. He didn't smile, not quite, but something moved near the corners of his mouth. Something that, in another person, would have been the precursor to one. Get some sleep, he said. I'll watch him. Sera started to object. Sera. His voice was quiet but definitive. You haven't slept in 36 hours. Andreu is 2 floors down. I'm not going anywhere. He looked at her with an expression that meant he knew she was about to argue and had already decided to wait her out. Get some sleep. She looked at Theo, who was now attempting to climb over the crib rail using Nicholas's arm as a ladder. He's going to fall, she said. Then I'll catch him. A pause. I'm going to catch him, Sera. That's what I'm here for. Let me do it. She sat with that for a moment. Then slowly she stood. She crossed to the crib and pressed her lips against Theo's forehead, warm but fever warm, not crisis warm, not the terrible dry heat of the night before. He patted her face. I'll be right there, she said, nodding toward the adjoining room. He knows, Nicholas said. He was looking at Theo. Go. She went. She lay down on the bed in the adjoining room and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds filtering through the door, Nicholas's low voice, Theo's intermittent responses. The creak of the chair when Nicholas shifted. The normal sounds of a morning after a crisis. The sounds of a man learning something new about himself quietly in a room she wasn't in. She was asleep inside 5 minutes. The day she'd been running from for 18 months had finally arrived. And somehow, impossibly, it had not destroyed her. Somehow, against every calculation she'd made, it had brought her to this specific room, this specific morning, this small measure of something that might, if she let herself believe in it, be described as relief. Outside, the Aegean sun climbed over Athens. Inside, Nicholas Dracos held his son and waited for the world to come back. It always did. But this time he found he didn't mind. The island compound had a name. Stavri, a small word in Greek meaning cross, named for the way 2 ridgelines met on the island's highest point, forming a natural intersection visible from the sea on clear days. It was barely 3 kilometers across, uninhabited, except for the compound itself sitting off the Saronic Gulf, in the precise middle of nowhere, close enough to Athens to reach quickly, remote enough that no one came close without reason. Nicholas had purchased it 11 years ago for purposes that had nothing to do with the warmth of the afternoon light through the residential wing windows, or the way the garden on the southern slope caught the sea breeze, or the fact that a 2-year-old boy could run across the flat lawn on his uncertain legs with his arms out like he was testing the air for resistance. He had purchased it for operational reasons. Defensibility, controllable access, clean sightlines. He had not imagined using it for this. Theo thought the boat ride was the greatest event in human history. He stood at the bow with his hands gripping the rail and shrieked with delight every time the hull slapped a wave, his dark curls flattening in the wind, his face entirely open to the experience, in the way only children under 3 managed, completely without reservation, as if the world existed specifically for this moment. Sera stood beside him with both hands ready to catch him, her jaw set against the wind, her eyes moving between Theo and the horizon and the armed personnel stationed at intervals along the deck. The armed personnel were trying not to smile, failing. He's been awake since 5, Sera said, as Nicholas appeared beside her. He is going to crash before we dock. There's a bedroom set up in the residential wing. I know. You texted Petros from the dock. She glanced at him. You're very good at logistics. It's been useful, I imagine. She looked back at Theo, who had discovered he could make the wind change direction by holding his hand flat and angling it, and was deeply absorbed in the science of this. I want to be clear about something before we get there. You generally want to be clear about things. I want to be clear about this specifically. She turned to face him. The wind was pulling strands of her hair across her face. She pushed them back impatiently. I'm cooperating with the security because the threat is real, and I'm not an idiot. But I'm not going to pretend this is something it isn't. We're not a family. We're 2 people who share a child who are trying to figure out what that means. A pause. I need you to understand that. Nicholas studied her. Are you saying that for my benefit or yours? Sera blinked. Because I'm aware of what we are, he continued. I'm not operating under illusions about the nature of what you came back to. You called me because you needed something. You're here because leaving isn't currently safe. Neither of those things means what you think I think they mean. And what do you think they mean? He looked at Theo, who had now abandoned the aerodynamics experiment in favor of attempting to wave at a passing cargo ship as if its crew could see him. They mean we start from here. Whatever here is. Sera was quiet for a moment. Okay, she said. That's reasonable. I can be reasonable. I'm aware. It just doesn't come naturally to you. The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile adjacent to one. Sera noticed it and looked away before he could see that she had. Stavri rose out of the water as the boat rounded the eastern headland stone walls, visible above the tree line, the main compound's upper floor catching the afternoon light, a narrow dock jutting into the small harbor where two security boats sat at anchor. From the water, it looked almost peaceful. Sera knew it wasn't, not really, but she could see why he'd chosen this specific place. There was something about the scale of the sea around it that made the walls feel less like confinement and more like a natural edge. She was not going to let herself be deceived by aesthetics, but she noted them. Theo fell asleep in her arms before they reached the dock exactly as predicted, one moment awake, and exclaiming the next simply gone as if someone had flipped a switch. His head dropped against her shoulder with the decisive weight of total unconsciousness. She held him and walked the dock with Nicholas beside her, and tried to prepare herself for the next phase of a situation she still didn't fully understand. The residential wing was nothing like she'd expected. She'd expected the compound's operational aesthetic, steel and glass, and the deliberate minimalism of a space designed for function over comfort. What she got instead was pale stone walls and wide windows facing the sea furniture that was simple but warm, a terrace off the main sitting room that looked across 50 feet of garden to the cliff's edge and the water beyond. There were olive trees in the garden, twisted and ancient, and terracotta pots of herbs along the terrace wall, and a child's tricycle parked near the door that she was fairly certain had not existed 2 days ago. She looked at the tricycle for a long moment. "You had 3 days' notice," she said. "Less. Petros handles details efficiently. It's a tricycle. He's a child. Children have tricycles." Nicholas said this as if it were a fact he had always known, had perhaps invented, rather than something he'd clearly looked up in the last 48 hours. Sera looked at the tricycle, then at Nicholas, then at the sleeping child against her shoulder. "Thank you," she said quietly. She carried Theo to the bedroom. Petros indicated small, warm, with a proper crib in the corner, and a window that looked out over the olive trees, and laid him down with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this transfer approximately 400 times without waking the subject. He barely stirred. She stood in the doorway for a moment watching him sleep. Then she went back to the main sitting room. Nicholas was at the terrace door looking out at the water. "Tell me about Vassos," she said. He turned. "We're here because of him," she said. "I should understand the actual situation." Nicholas studied her for a moment. Then he sat in one of the chairs and for the second time in 24 hours explained something he would not ordinarily have explained. Leonidas Vassos was third generation. His grandfather had built the original operation on black market shipping in the 1970s. His father had expanded it through the chaos of the Greek financial crisis, buying leverage cheaply. Leonidas himself had refined it into something that was almost legitimate on paper, the way Nicholas's operation was almost legitimate on paper, except that Vassos had none of Nicholas's interest in actually becoming legitimate. He was methodical, patient, and deeply vindictive. The dispute 6 months ago, Territorial Financial, a shipping corridor that both families believed they owned, had ended in a public resolution and a private state of active Cold War. "He's looking for the thing I won't trade," Nicholas said. "Us," Sera said. "You're more precise than that. He's looking for the thing I can't afford to lose. He doesn't know yet what that is. When he finds out, he'll use it." "Yes," Sera crossed her arms. "So what's the plan?" "The plan is to resolve the situation before he finds out." "How?" "That's still being determined." He held her gaze. "I'm not going to manage him through you. I want to be explicit about that. Whatever I do about Vassos, it will not involve you as a bargaining piece." "I know." She said it before she'd thought about it, and then considered what she'd said and found it was true. Whatever Nicholas was, he wasn't that. She'd known him long enough, had access to enough of the contradictions of him to be certain of that specific thing. "I just need to understand what I'm in the middle of." "That's fair." "Nicholas?" She waited until he looked at her. "I'm going to push back on things. I need you to know that now. The way this goes, me cooperating, Theo being here, us figuring out what any of this means, it only works if I can push back and you don't treat it as a threat to your authority." The silence that followed was careful. I don't experience disagreement as a threat, he said. You experience it as an inconvenience you can override. His jaw tightened fractionally. That's true. She raised an eyebrow. A longer silence. I'll work on it, he said. She nodded. That's all I'm asking. The compound's rhythm was strange to settle into. Strange, and she was surprised to find not entirely unpleasant. The security was omnipresent, but not oppressive cameras. At the perimeters, guards at the gate, personnel visible at a distance in the operational part of the facility. In the residential wing itself, the only regular presence was Petros, who appeared when needed with the uncanny timing of someone who had installed the sensation of being watched so thoroughly that the watching became invisible, and Demi, a woman in her 30s, who managed the residential household with a combination of warmth and spectacular efficiency that Sera recognized immediately as the particular competence of someone who was very good at their actual job and understood the value of it. Theo, for his part, adapted instantly. He always had. Sera had moved him 4 times in 18 months, 3 apartments, and a 3-week stay in a cousin's house in Heraklion when she thought she was being followed, which turned out to be paranoia, but had felt necessary at the time. Each move had produced approximately 2 hours of disruption before Theo recalibrated and adopted the new environment as if it had always been his. She'd been grateful for this flexibility, while also finding it slightly alarming as if she were watching a quality that had a different source, the absolute adaptability of someone who had survived by never assuming any arrangement was permanent. Theo followed Nicholas around. This began on the second morning and did not stop. Wherever Nicholas went in the residential wing or the garden, Theo appeared at a distance of approximately 4 feet, proceeding with the concentrated focus of a scientist engaged in fieldwork. When Nicholas sat, Theo sat or attempted to, often missing the chair and landing beside it with a thud that didn't bother him in the slightest. When Nicholas stood at the terrace looking at the water, Theo stood beside him, also looking at the water, apparently convinced that this was the appropriate response to water. He's studying you, Sera said on the 3rd morning, watching from the doorway, as Nicholas, seated at the outdoor table with his laptop and a cup of coffee, managed the dual task of reviewing operational reports and tolerating Theo's ongoing investigation of his keyboard. He's been studying the keyboard for 20 minutes, Nicholas said, not looking up. He's working out what it does. Theo pressed a key with great deliberateness. Nothing happened because Nicholas had locked the screen. Theo pressed it again, considered. He's persistent. I've noticed. He gets that from you. She said it without thinking and then registered what she'd said and waited. Nicholas looked up. You think so? The way he approaches things, he doesn't understand. He doesn't back off. He just keeps gathering information until he figures it out. She paused. It's the same. She shrugged, made herself sound matter-of-fact. Genetically, it makes sense. Nicholas looked at Theo for a moment. He's fearless. He's 18 months old. He hasn't learned what to be afraid of yet. Maybe. He looked back at his screen. Or maybe some people just start that way. Sera watched Theo press another key. Nicholas unlocked the screen and let him have it for 30 seconds, a peace offering that Theo accepted with delighted gravitas, mashing the keyboard with flat-palmed enthusiasm before Nicholas quietly reclaimed it. She went inside to make coffee and told herself that the warmth in her chest was not relevant to anything. The 4th day brought Vassos's opening move. Nicholas's expression, when he came to find her, told her something had changed before he said a word. He found her in the garden with Theo, who was performing his ongoing research into the relationship between dirt and gravity, and he crouched down briefly to intercept Theo before looking at Sera. He's made contact, Nicholas said. Through an intermediary. He wants a meeting. Does he know about us? Not yet. But he's asking for a meeting specifically because he knows something is being protected. He doesn't know what. He stood brushing dried grass from his knee. He'll send the intermediary to the port at Piraeus. I'll go in person. Alone. With Petros in a detail. Sera looked at him. What does he want? He wants what he always wants. Territory. Revenue. He'll phrase it as an opportunity to present himself as reasonable and watch for what I'm not willing to give. That's how he works. He offers you things you don't want to see what you'll refuse. And you're going to refuse everything. I'm going to refuse nothing. I'm going to listen. He met her eyes. Listening is free. It tells me how much he already knows. She nodded slowly. When? Tomorrow morning. I'll be back by afternoon. He watched her. Petros stays here. The compound security doubles while I'm gone. Nicholas? Yes? Be careful. She held his gaze. I know that's not something you usually need to be told. I'm telling you anyway. Something moved behind his eyes. Something she filed away without examining too closely. I'll be careful, he said. He went to collect Theo from the dirt investigation, lifting the boy with the ease of someone who had already decided this was natural holding him, while Theo explained at length what he had discovered about the texture of the soil near the olive trees. Nicholas listened with the expression of someone receiving a detailed briefing. Theo pointed at things. Nicholas looked where he was pointed. Sera watched from 10 feet away and felt the ground shift under her slightly, as if the island's geometry had changed. She was not falling in love with him again. She was simply noticing that he was not who she'd left. Or perhaps he was who she'd left, but there was more of him now. More visible. More of the parts she'd caught glimpses of in the margins of his life. The person he'd been in the dark at 2 in the morning when no one was watching, and the controlled precision relaxed into something different. She went inside and made dinner because Demi had the evening off, and it was something to do with her hands. Nicholas came in from the garden still carrying Theo, who had fallen asleep on his shoulder with the customary abruptness, and stopped in the kitchen doorway. "You're cooking," he said. "I'm making pasta," she said. "Try not to make it sound like a miracle. In this household, it qualifies." He looked at the pot on the stove with the expression of a man who had not eaten a domestic meal in years. "Demi usually—" "I know. She told me." Sera adjusted the heat. "Sit down. Don't wake him." Nicholas sat at the kitchen island, still holding the sleeping Theo, with the careful stability of someone who had learned precisely how to not disturb a sleeping child. He looked at the kitchen as if he was seeing it for the first time. The ordered warmth of it, the smells, the particular ordinary intimacy of someone making food at 6 in the evening. "How long since anyone cooked in this kitchen?" she asked, without turning around. "I don't know. I usually eat in my study." "That's terrible for you." "Probably." She got plates, set them on the counter, served pasta with the methodical efficiency of someone who has been cooking for 1.5 for 18 months and finds it automatic. They ate at the kitchen island, Theo still asleep against Nicholas's shoulder, the sea light coming in at an angle through the window, and the island settling into evening around them. And Sera thought, this is the most domestic thing I have ever done with him, and it feels dangerous in a way that has nothing to do with Leonidas Vassos. "What are you thinking?" Nicholas said. She looked up. "You have the expression you used to get when you were working through a problem," he said. "I have a lot of problems." "Yes." His voice was dry. "Any in particular?" She looked at her plate, at the window, at Theo's sleeping face pressed against Nicholas's shoulder with the boneless trust of total unconsciousness. "I was thinking," she said carefully, "that this is complicated." "It is, and that I don't know what to do with complicated. You seem to manage." "I manage alone. I'm used to alone." She set down her fork. "This is something else." Nicholas was quiet for a moment. The island sounds came in through the window. Water wind, the distant automated alert from the perimeter that cycled every hour, proof that the walls were holding. "I'm not good at this either," he said finally. She glanced at him. "I'm proficient at most things," he continued. "This—" He looked at Theo, then at her with the precision of a man choosing words carefully, "is not one of them. I am learning as I go. I would prefer you knew that rather than assuming otherwise." Sera studied him. In 3 years of knowing him, 18 months of silence included, he had said a version of this to her perhaps twice. The admission of limitation, the specific vulnerability of telling someone what you couldn't do. "Okay," she said. Okay, we're both learning as we go." She picked up her fork. "That's the most honest thing either of us has said in the last week." Nicholas's mouth curved at one corner. "Eat your pasta," she said. He ate. Outside, the Saronic night settled in around the island, and the walls held, and in the morning Nicholas would go to Piraeus to listen to a man who wanted to destroy them, and the situation was complicated and uncertain, and there was no version of this that was without danger. But tonight there was pasta and a sleeping child, and something fragile and new taking shape in the space between two people who had spent 18 months on opposite ends of a silence neither of them had wanted. It wasn't resolution. It wasn't even quite peace. It was a beginning, and for the moment that had to be enough. Nicholas left before dawn. Sera heard the boat engine from her bedroom, a low, purposeful sound in the pre-dawn quiet, the kind that carried across water differently than any other direction, intimate and distant at once. She lay still and listened to it fade and told herself she wasn't tracking the sound longer than necessary. She got up, made coffee, stood on the terrace in the early gray light and watched the sea. Petros appeared at 6 a.m. with a briefing she hadn't asked for and found she needed. "The meeting at Piraeus is scheduled for 9, he said. "Mr. Dracos has a clear route and a secondary exit if required. I'll have updates every 30 minutes. He handed her a small radio. "This will reach me directly. Any concerns, use it immediately." Sera turned the radio over in her hands. "He briefed you to brief me." "Yes." Petros's expression didn't change, but something in it acknowledged that this was for Nicholas Dracos a notable departure from standard practice. "He's not usually this transparent," she said. "No? Why now?" "You would have to ask him." Petros paused. "Though I suspect the answer involves the fact that someone worth being transparent with is currently present." He left before she could respond. Sera stood on the terrace with the radio in one hand and her coffee in the other and the sea going silver in the early light, and tried to organize her feelings into something useful. Theo woke at 6:30 in a spectacular mood, announcing his consciousness with a series of sound effects that suggested he'd been awake for some time running through his material before committing to the full performance. Sera collected him from the crib, and they had breakfast on the terrace, Theo eating with the focused determination of someone refueling after extended mental work, pausing occasionally to point at birds with the solemnity of an expert identifying specimens. "Bird," Theo said, pointing at a gull. "Bird," Sera confirmed. "Beer." He pointed at another one, then at the sky in general, apparently categorizing it. "Birr, birr, birr." "Yes, there are a lot of them." Theo pointed at the horizon. "That's the sea," Sera said. "Sea," Theo repeated with sudden gravity. He looked at it for a long moment. "Da sea," he said. Sera looked at where he was pointing, at the stretch of water between the island and the mainland, the direction the boat had gone. "Yeah," she said softly. "Dada's at the sea." Theo nodded. This apparently satisfied him. He returned to his toast. "Nah." The meeting in Piraeus lasted 4 hours. Nicholas returned to the island compound at 1:30 in the afternoon, stepping off the boat with the controlled, unhurried movement of a man who was thinking faster than he was, appearing to move, a quality Sera had always been able to read in him, the particular calibration of someone running active calculations behind a still expression. He found her in the garden where Theo was currently involved in a detailed investigation of the olive tree trunks and had acquired a quantity of bark dust that suggested either scientific rigor or poor boundary setting on Sera's part. Nicholas crouched down at Theo's level. "Da." Theo presented a handful of bark dust as if this were a gift. "Thank you," Nicholas said seriously. "What did we find?" Theo showed him at length, with considerable pride. Nicholas listened, and Sera watched this and did not examine why it made her chest tight. When Theo's report concluded, satisfied with his debriefing, he returned to the tree. Nicholas stood and looked at Sera. "Talk to me," she said. "Inside," he said, "where you can't hear tone." Children didn't understand words, but they read tone with the precision of instruments calibrated for nothing else. Sera had learned this in the first 6 months of Theo's life, when she'd had to train herself to discuss finances and fears and the circumstances of their situation in a register that didn't reach him. She followed Nicholas inside. "Vassos already knows more than we thought," Nicholas said. He had a photograph. Sera's stomach dropped. "Of what?" "You. Getting off the boat at Stavri 2 days ago." He held her gaze. "The photograph is recent. He has eyes on the harbor. So he knows I exist. He knows you exist and that I brought you here. He doesn't know about Theo yet." Nicholas moved to the window, his back to her briefly, the particular tension in his shoulders that she recognized as the body of someone thinking through options they haven't finished mapping. He was pleasant about it. He presented it as concerned old friend, just wants to understand, doesn't want things to escalate. It was a message that he's watching and that he has reach. He turned. The photograph was the real communication. "What did you say?" "I said you were a medical professional I'd engaged for personal reasons, nothing strategic. I said there was no leverage available through you." He paused. He didn't believe me. Of course he didn't. Sera crossed her arms. "Because it's not true." "No." She looked at him. "What happens now?" "Now," Nicholas said carefully, "we change the calculus. The current situation you hear protected but unknown, a secret. He's working to define that uncertainty is valuable to him. It keeps him investigating. The way to close that investigation is to give him a complete picture that changes his read on the risk." "What kind of complete picture?" Nicholas was quiet for a moment. "The kind where you're not a vulnerability shot," he said. "Where you're a position. Where moving against you costs more than it gains." He looked at her steadily. The kind where the message is that what's mine is defended, not hidden, that the cost of coming near you isn't worth whatever he thinks the benefit is. Sera studied him. You're talking about making us visible, strategically visible, on my terms, not his. How does that work? It works, Nicholas said. If you're willing to stand beside me rather than behind a set of gates while I handle it. He held her gaze. I'm not going to ask you to do something you're not willing to do. That's a genuine choice, not a tactical gesture. But if you're willing to walk into a room with Vassos and let him see that we're a unit, that you're not afraid that I'm not alone in this. He stopped. It changes the math. The garden sounds came through the window. Theo's ongoing commentary to the olive trees, the distant sea, the compound's quiet security rhythms. When, she said, not yet, we need to prepare, but within the week if you're willing. Sera looked at the window. At the olive trees, the old stone walls, the strip of blue sea beyond the garden's edge. I'm willing, she said. Something shifted in Nicholas's expression. Not relief, he was too controlled for relief to surface cleanly, but adjacent to it. The barely visible exhale of someone who'd been holding a question in reserve and had received the answer they'd hoped for. We'll do it together, he said. Yes, she said. We will. Outside, Theo sat under the olive tree and very carefully arranged pieces of bark in a pattern that only he understood, humming to himself in the uncomplicated way of someone whose world was for this particular afternoon exactly what it needed to be. Sera stood inside and understood that she had crossed some line somewhere in the last 5 days that she had not fully mapped in advance. She was not running anymore. That wasn't the same as knowing what she was doing instead. But it was a start. 3 days later, Nicholas's younger brother arrived. His name was Alexandros Alex to everyone except their mother's formal portrait, and he arrived on the afternoon boat with a duffel bag, a bottle of wine, and the kind of energy that preceded significant disruption. He was 33, 4 years younger than Nicholas, and where Nicholas moved through rooms like a weather system making decisions about where to break, Alex moved through them like sunlight present warm, impossible to ignore without trying. Theo heard the boat and was at the dock before Petros could prevent it. Alex crouched down to Theo's level, looked at him for approximately 2 seconds and said, You are a very serious-looking individual. I like you already. Theo considered this assessment and then offered Alex a rock he'd been carrying for 3 days. Excellent, Alex said, receiving the rock with complete gravity. Thank you, I'll treasure it. Theo decided on this basis that Alex was acceptable. Nicholas watched this from the dock entrance with an expression that was approximately what Sera would describe as fond. If fond were a frequency he could access only at low volumes. She met Alex properly in the main sitting room an hour later after Theo had been persuaded that more bark investigation could wait until tomorrow. Alex shook her hand with the warmth of someone who was genuinely glad to meet her rather than performing gladness, and looked at her with eyes that were the same shape as Nicholas's but held everything Nicholas kept contained. You're braver than you look, he said. That's a compliment. Is it? My brother had the entire Aegean coast looking for you for 8 months. He settled into a chair easy and comfortable in a space that was technically his brother's fortress. Most people don't disappear from Nicholas successfully. You did it for 18 months. I'm impressed. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. No. You were trying to survive. Even more impressive. He picked up his wine glass. He didn't tell me about you until you came back, which tells me you mattered. Sera looked at him. He doesn't protect things he doesn't care about, Alex said simply. He controls them. Protecting them is different. Across the room, Nicholas was watching this exchange with the expression of someone who would prefer it to stop, but has correctly assessed that intervening would be worse. You're going to get in trouble for telling me that, Sera said. Probably. Alex looked cheerful about it. But you seem like someone who could use the information. That night, after Theo was asleep and the island had settled into darkness, Nicholas and Alex sat on the terrace with their wine, and Sera could hear the low murmur of their voices through the window. She didn't listen, deliberately. Didn't listen, but she could hear the shape of it. 2 brothers in the dark talking through something that mattered. She went to check on Theo instead. He was asleep on his back with his arms flung out wide, the same position he'd been sleeping in since birth, as if he were trying to take up as much space as possible, even in unconsciousness. She stood in the doorway for a moment and felt the weight of the week settling in around her. She'd run from Athens because she'd been afraid. She was back in Athens on an island off Athens because the fear had run out and been replaced by something harder, something with more load-bearing capacity. Not courage, exactly. something more practical. The understanding that fear had a cost too, and the cost had been 18 months of everything she'd just spent the last week watching Nicholas learn, 18 months of his son's voice, his laugh, the particular way he pressed his hands flat against a keyboard, the weight of him asleep on a shoulder. She'd made a choice 18 months ago. She was making a different one now. She went back to the main room. Nicholas was inside, Alex apparently having retreated to the guest room. Nicholas stood at the window looking at the dark water, holding his wine glass, but not drinking. He talks a lot, Nicholas said without turning around. Alex, yes. Sera sat on the couch. He's not wrong, though. He rarely is. It's one of his more irritating qualities. She looked at the back of Nicholas's head, at the particular way he held himself when he was working through something. The meeting with Vassos, the one you want me to be at. He turned. I want to understand exactly what you need from me, she said. Not operationally. What you actually need. So I can decide whether I'm doing it because it's strategically useful or because I'm choosing to. He came away from the window and sat across from her. The terrace light made the angles of his face sharper, the familiar architecture of them that Theo had inherited in pieces. I need Vassos to understand, he said carefully, that you're not a leverage point. The way to communicate that isn't to hide you, because hiding implies value and fear. The way to communicate it is to let him see that you're a partner, that you're choosing to be here, that the entity he would be threatening is not a woman protected by walls, but a woman who made a decision and is standing by it. A partner, she said. Yes. Not a possession, not a liability being managed. No. She held his gaze. And is that what you actually think of me? Or is that what you're saying for the meeting? A very long pause. Both, Nicholas said finally. It's what I think and it's what I need him to understand. They happen to be the same thing. Sera studied him. The room was quiet. Outside, the water moved in the dark. Okay, she said. Okay. I'm going to hold you to the word partner, she said, in every context, not just when it's strategically useful. I expect you to. She stood. Good. Then I'm in. She picked up her wine glass. We should both sleep. Theo is going to be awake at 5:30 because he can sense when adults are tired. Nicholas's mouth curved slightly. Does he do that deliberately? I genuinely don't know. She paused at the door. Nicholas. Yes. She looked at him across the room. In the low light, he looked different from the man she'd run from. He looked like the man she'd glimpsed underneath that one, the one she'd been trying not to let herself see, because seeing him had felt like a reason to stay, and staying had felt impossible. Thank you, she said, for the way you've been with him. You didn't have to make it this easy. Nicholas's expression shifted. Something crossed it she couldn't fully name. He's not a task, he said quietly. I know. She held his gaze for a moment. That's what I'm thanking you for. She went to her room. The island held quiet around them. In the garden, the olive trees moved in the night wind. On the perimeter, the security team completed their rotation. In the crib, Theo slept with his arms flung wide. And in the main sitting room, Nicholas Drakos sat alone for a while, looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of a man who had just understood something about himself he hadn't been ready to understand, and was deciding what to do with it. The next morning brought a development no one had prepared for. Theo said his first sentence. It happened at breakfast without ceremony while he was eating yogurt, and Nicholas was reading reports, and Sera was refilling her coffee. Theo looked up from his bowl, pointed at Nicholas, and said, with the calm authority of someone confirming an established fact, Das stay. The kitchen went still. Nicholas looked up from his papers. Das stay. Theo repeated slightly more firmly, the way he said things he considered self-evident. Sera set down her coffee cup. Nicholas looked at Theo, at the small, certain face, at the point-blank clarity of a child who had made an assessment and was communicating it without nuance or strategy, who had simply observed the variables and reached a conclusion. Yeah, Nicholas said quietly. Das stays. Theo nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to his yogurt. Sera picked up her coffee. Her hands were very steady. He's never done that before, she said. 2 words together like that. First sentence. Nicholas looked at Theo for a moment longer than he needed to. Is that normal at this age? On the early side, some kids earlier. She paused. He had something to say. Nicholas looked at her. He had something he needed to make sure of, she said carefully. He wanted confirmation. I see. So did you just... She stopped, started again. You just made a commitment to an 18-month-old. Nicholas's expression didn't change. I made a commitment to my son. Yes. Sera looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Theo, who was now investigating what happened if you put yogurt on your own knee. Okay, she said for what felt like the fourth time in a week, and meant something different each time. She wasn't sure yet exactly what this version meant, but she thought it might mean something important. The meeting with Leonidas Vassos was held in a private room above a restaurant in Kolonaki, neutral territory technically. In practice, everything in Kolonaki had allegiances. The money that moved through the neighborhood's marble-fronted establishments was old Greek money, the kind that didn't take sides publicly, but understood implicitly that Nicholas Drakos' version of the city was more stable and therefore more profitable than Vassos' version. The room upstairs had been agreed to by both parties as equidistant from their respective centers of gravity. It was in Nicholas's assessment approximately equidistant in the way that anywhere is equidistant if you don't examine the geometry too carefully. He arrived 8 minutes before the appointed time. Sera arrived with him. She wore a dark dress she'd borrowed from Demi's Simple Architectural, the kind of thing that looked like confidence rather than effort. Her hair was up. She was Nicholas noted doing the thing she did when she was calibrating reading every person in the room, with her nurse's inventory cataloging information, deciding what she was dealing with before she needed to decide how to deal with it. She had been doing this her entire career. In the trauma bay at Thessaloniki, she'd told him once you learned in the first 10 seconds what a patient's body was trying to tell you. You learned to read the signs you weren't supposed to be looking for. She was reading the room above the restaurant in Kolonaki with exactly that precision. 2 of his men are already here, she said quietly as they crossed the anteroom. By the window and near the kitchen entrance. I know, Nicholas said. The one by the kitchen is holding his right arm slightly differently. Old injury or recent one? Nicholas glanced at her. Shoulder, she said. The way he's compensating his stance. A pause. I'm not sure why that's useful. I just notice. It's useful, he said. Leonidas Vassos was in his mid-60s, silver-haired, with the settled authority of a man who had long since stopped needing to assert himself, and had arrived at the stage where the assertion was simply ambient. He wore a suit that cost more than most people's monthly income, and sat at the center of the table with the ease of someone who believed as a matter of settled conviction that he was always in the most important seat in any room. He looked at Sera when they entered with the specific assessment of someone evaluating a variable. Nicholas. He stood courteous, deliberate. And this is the medical professional. This is Sera, Nicholas said. She's here because what concerns me concerns her. You should know that. Vassos tilted his head. Should I? Yes. They sat. The restaurant staff brought coffee and withdrew. The men by the window and the kitchen entrance were still. Sera folded her hands on the table with the equanimity of someone who had sat at the bedsides of dying people and learned that most circumstances were less frightening than they appeared. Vassos looked at her directly. You've been away from Athens for some time. 18 months, Sera said. And now you're back. And now I'm back. By choice or necessity? Both, she said. Usually those are the same thing. Vassos studied her for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating. Then he looked at Nicholas. You've changed your operation since she's been here. Fewer external meetings. More decisions made from the compound. He smiled thin and precise. You're protecting something. I'm being efficient, Nicholas said. The two aren't mutually exclusive. No, but they're not usually the same thing either. Vassos picked up his coffee cup. I'm a practical man, Nicholas. I don't come to meetings to deliver threats. I come to them to understand situations. He set the cup down. The situation I'm trying to understand is whether the change in your disposition represents an opportunity or a complication. Neither, Nicholas said. It represents a state of affairs that doesn't affect you unless you make it affect you. That's reassuring. The tone was not reassured. And the woman, she's a partner, Nicholas said. Not a vulnerability, not leverage. A partner. If you're building a model of my situation that involves her as a point of access, you need to rebuild it. Vassos looked at Sera. Is that accurate, he said, from your perspective? Sera held his gaze. She'd been sitting very still, very present in the particular way she'd learned in emergency medicine, the stillness that communicated availability rather than tension. I've been at this table for 8 minutes, she said. You've been watching me since I walked in. I understand why. You're trying to figure out if I'm here because I want to be or because I was brought. Vassos's expression shifted fractionally. I'm here because I chose to be, she continued. I came back to Athens because my son needed his father. I stayed because I made a decision. She kept her voice level. I don't know your world in detail, but I understand enough of it to know that the calculation you're running, is she a weakness? Is she a way in? The answer is no. And if you pursue it, you'll spend significant resources confirming an answer you could have accepted now. The room was very quiet. Vassos looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression that was not quite respect, but occupied adjacent territory. Then he looked at Nicholas. She's direct, he said. She is. Where did you find her? She found me. Nicholas's voice was flat, but there was something underneath it that Vassos heard because his eyes moved to Nicholas's face with renewed attention. She's the mother of my son. That's the complete picture. It's not a secret and it's not an invitation. The silence that followed was of a different quality from the previous ones. Vassos turned his coffee cup on its saucer once deliberately. A son, he said. Yes. How old? 18 months. Vassos was quiet. He looked at the table at the middle distance with an expression that was doing its calculation in a way he wasn't fully concealing. Then he looked at Sera again. What's his name? He said. Theo, she said. Vassos nodded slowly. He said nothing for a moment. Then, my grandson was that age when his father died. 3 years ago. He picked up his coffee. It's a difficult age to lose a parent. Neither Sera nor Nicholas said anything. I'm going to be direct with you, Vassos said, setting the cup down. Not out of courtesy, out of efficiency. He looked at Nicholas. I've been building a case for 6 months. I won't deny it. I believe the instability in your operation, the distraction, the softening was an opportunity. I was wrong about the source of it. He glanced at Sera. And possibly wrong about what it means. Are you telling me to correct my model? Nicholas said. I'm telling you that a man with a son has more to lose, and that men with more to lose are either more dangerous or more careful. Vassos looked at him steadily. I'm deciding which applies to you. Both, Nicholas said. Vassos smiled. It was a different smile from the earlier one, still cold at the edges, but with something genuine in its center. Honest answer. He stood. I'll take that under consideration. They stood. One more thing, Vassos said to Sera. What you said about spending resources confirming an answer you could accept now. He paused. That's good advice. I'll try to remember it. He left. His men followed. The room felt larger without them. Sera exhaled slowly. That was, she started. Not over, Nicholas said, but different. We moved the conversation. He's not going to stand down because of one meeting. No, but he recalibrated. Nicholas looked at her. His son died. He has a grandson. The detail about Theo landed somewhere he wasn't expecting. Sera thought about this, about the way Vassos's expression had shifted when Nicholas said son, the particular quality of the pause. He's still dangerous. Yes, but right now at this moment he's thinking about his grandson instead of about leverage. She turned toward the door. That's a window. It is. They walked out into Kolonaki's afternoon pale light on marble facades, pedestrians, and pigeons, in the specific genteel noise of a wealthy neighborhood, and Nicholas stayed a half-step closer to her than strictly necessary, a proximity that felt less like strategy and more like habit. She didn't move away. They reached the island by late afternoon. Theo had been in Alex's care for the duration, a fact that had produced, according to Petros's terse update, a morning of significant bark investigation, an incident involving the garden hose, and one enthusiastic attempt by Theo to climb the perimeter wall using Alex's body as a ladder. Alex had described this as a successful morning and appeared to mean it. Theo was wet, cheerful, and covered in a combination of garden soil and whatever he'd eaten for lunch that Sera decided not to examine too closely. He greeted them at the dock with the confident assumption that his return was the primary event of the afternoon. Nicholas picked him up. This happened now with the automatic ease of something that had only taken a week to become natural. Theo, reaching up. Nicholas, reaching down, the transfer accomplished without the slight careful hesitation of the first time. Theo grabbed Nicholas's collar and told him with great urgency about the garden hose. Is that so? Nicholas said. Theo confirmed that it was so in detail. Sera watched them walk up the dock path together, her son and his father. Theo's small hands gesturing, Nicholas listening with the full attentive quality he gave to things that mattered, and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for 18 months. Not certainty, not safety exactly, something more honest than either of those. The understanding that she had been more wrong in her running than she'd let herself believe. Not about the danger was real, they'd spent the afternoon proving it. But about the other part, about what Theo would have been without this, about what she would have been. She followed them up from the dock and into the compound. Alex appeared in the courtyard with the energy of someone reporting for debrief. How did it go? Productive, Nicholas said. Productive like no one was shot, or productive like we actually made progress? Both. Nicholas looked at him over Theo's head. He has a grandson. Alex's expression shifted. Vassos. 3 years old, his son died. Alex absorbed this. Soft point. Not something we'd exploit, but something he heard. Nicholas set Theo down. He's recalibrating. That buys time. Time for what? For the actual resolution. Nicholas looked at Sera. Which we need to discuss. They sat on the terrace that evening, Theo asleep early after the garden hose incident. Alex present but quieter than usual. The Saronic dark settling in around the island. Nicholas outlined what he believed the resolution needed to look like a formal arrangement structured and documented that changed the territory calculation enough to make Vassos's aggression more costly than his compliance. Not a surrender, a restructuring. The Pyrrhos shipping corridor shared access mutually enforceable. You'd give him access to the corridor, Alex said. Shared access, on terms that make violation costly for both of us. He looked at Sera. What I won't do is the kind of arrangement that treats this. He gestured a minimal motion toward the house behind them, toward the sleeping child inside. As part of the negotiation, it's not available. That has to be clear in whatever we agree to. And if he pushes back on that, Alex said, then we're at war, Nicholas said simply, and he knows what that looks like. Sera had been listening. You could end this faster if you offered him something that mattered more to him than the leverage. Both brothers looked at her. What could matter more to him? Alex said. His grandson. She kept her voice steady. Not as leverage in our direction as a point of contact. He's a grandfather who lost a son. He mentioned it unprompted. That's not tactical, that's personal. She looked at Nicholas. If you approached him differently, not as Vassos the rival, but as someone who understands what it means to have something irreplaceable to protect. He'd see it as manipulation, Nicholas said, only if it isn't genuine. She met his gaze. You have a son, too. An 18-month-old who has no idea his father runs one of the most dangerous operations in the Aegean. That's not nothing. That's the same position he was in once and didn't survive. She paused. People respond to honesty they're not expecting. Alex was looking at Nicholas with an expression that said he found this specific observation significant. Nicholas was quiet for a moment. You're saying we lead with Theo, he said, not with the corridor. I'm saying you lead with the truth, which is that you're trying to build something your son can inherit without it killing him. She held his gaze. That's what you want, isn't it? The island sounds moved around them in the quiet that followed. Water whined, the automation of the perimeter running its cycle. Yes, Nicholas said finally. Then say that to Vassos. Not as a strategy, as a fact. She looked at her wine glass. He might say no. He might use it. But you won't know until you try, and the version of this where you go to war costs more than the version where you're honest with a man who understood something once about what you understand now. Alex cleared his throat quietly. She's good at this. I know, Nicholas said. Sera looked at the sea. I was a trauma nurse for 3 years, she said. You learn what people are actually afraid of underneath whatever they're performing. Vassos is performing power. What he's afraid of is irrelevance. She paused. A man who matters to his grandson isn't irrelevant. Give him that and you don't need the corridor. Nicholas sat with this for a long time. I'll request another meeting, he said finally. Good. We'll go together again. Sera looked at him. If you need me there, yes. I need you there. He said it without the tactical framing he'd used the first time. Simply, as a fact. Not for the strategy because it changes the conversation. She held his gaze. Okay, she said. Then I'll be there. The evening wound down slowly. Alex went inside. The terrace quieted. Nicholas stayed beside her without speaking for a while, both of them looking at the water. And the night was warm, and the sea was present, and something had shifted again. Another small increment in the long, careful process of rebuilding trust between two people who'd both earned reasons not to offer it. Can I ask you something? Sera said. Yes. When you were looking for me, the 8 months. She didn't look at him. Was it about the operation, about the security risk? The pause that followed was longer than necessary if the answer were no. No, he said. Then what? Another pause. I missed you, he said. 3 words said with the precise effort of someone lifting something heavier than it appeared. That's the simple answer. I missed you, and I didn't know what to do with that, so I searched for you instead. Sera was quiet for a moment. I missed you too, she said. That's why I didn't come back. It would have been easier if I hadn't. Nicholas turned to look at her. I know, he said quietly. They sat with that together on the terrace above the Saronic dark, while Theo slept inside, and the island held its quiet, careful watch. The second meeting with Vassos was different. Not in location, they returned to the same room above the restaurant in Kolonaki, the same arrangement of coffee cups and cautious courtesy, but in what Nicholas brought to it, which was not the controlled strategic patience of the first meeting, but something more specific, and for anyone who knew him, more unusual. He brought the truth. They sat across from Vassos and his quiet intermediary, and after the preliminary courtesies, the coffee, the weather, the ceremonial neutrality of men who had learned that how you began a conversation set the perimeter for what happened inside it. Nicholas said, I want to tell you something outside the operational discussion. Vassos raised an eyebrow. My son is 18 months old, Nicholas said. He doesn't know what I do. He doesn't know why we're here or what's at stake between us. He spent yesterday afternoon trying to feed crackers to the olive trees in the garden. A pause. He's not afraid of anything yet. I'd like to keep it that way for as long as possible. The room was very still. Vassos looked at him, then at Sera, then back at Nicholas. You're telling me this why, he said. Because you told me your son died 3 years ago. Your grandson is 3 now. Nicholas held his gaze. I'm not using that to access something. I'm telling you that I understand something I didn't understand 6 months ago, and that what I understand changes the math I've been running on this. He paused. I'm not interested in fighting you for the corridor. I'm interested in an arrangement that both of us can hand to the people who come after us. Because the alternative is a war that outlasts both of us and lands on them. The silence was long. Vassos sat back slowly. He looked at the table, at his hands, then finally at Nicholas. You're legitimizing, he said. I'm building something my son doesn't have to dismantle to survive, Nicholas said. That's not the same thing, but it's adjacent to it. And you want me to... I want you to consider whether what you're building is what you intended to leave behind. Nicholas's voice was even, unhurried. That's all. Another long silence. Vassos looked at Sera. And you, he said. You came back to him knowing this. I came back because my son was sick, Sera said. I stayed because I chose to. She met his gaze. I know what his world looks like. I've been deciding what to do with that for 18 months. And I've decided to do this instead of running from it. She paused. People are capable of choosing differently than they have been. It requires a reason. Vassos was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, the corridor, equal access shared enforcement, 5-year term with renegotiation. I want documentation. Nicholas nodded. Agreed. And if either party violates the arrangement, then we deserve what follows, Nicholas said, on both sides. Vassos extended his hand across the table. Nicholas shook it. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. They walked out into Kolonaki's afternoon lighter this time. Or perhaps it only felt lighter and reached the car before Sera said anything. He said yes because of the grandson, she said. He said yes because it was the right arrangement. Nicholas opened the door. The grandson was why he was willing to hear it. Sera got in. Distinction without a difference. No. Nicholas settled beside her, and for a moment he looked at her with the full, clear attention he used when he meant something precisely. The arrangement was the right one regardless. The fact that I presented it honestly instead of strategically, that was you. Sera looked out the window at Kolonaki sliding past. You would have gotten there eventually, she said. Possibly. A pause. But eventually has a cost I'm no longer interested in paying. The boat back to Stavri cut across water gone gold in the late afternoon, and Sera sat at the bow in approximately the same position she'd been in when Theo had stood there discovering the sea, and felt the distinction between who she'd been then and who she was becoming. Gradually become visible the way shorelines appeared from distance, uncertain at first, and then as you got closer, exactly as solid as they'd always been. She was not the person who had dialed that number 3 weeks ago in a cold sweat, with her son barely breathing in her arms. She was someone who had sat across a table from one of the most dangerous men in the Aegean and told him the truth and watched it work. That was something. She didn't know yet what it was going to cost. There were still calculations to run, arrangements to finalize, a world to learn to live inside rather than run from. There were conversations she and Nicholas hadn't had yet. Harder ones, the ones about the past and the future, and what the space between them actually meant, now that survival wasn't the only thing organizing it. But those were tomorrow's questions. Today she sat at the bow of a boat going home and let the wind take her hair and watched the island rise out of the water and thought I made a decision. She thought I'm not afraid of it. The dock appeared. Petros and two members of the security detail were waiting with the particular professional neutrality of people who had received news that things had gone well and were choosing not to celebrate it visibly. Theo was at the dock again. He was contained this time by Demi's hand around his collar, and his own sense of occasion standing very straight with the importance of someone who had been waiting and intended the waiting to be acknowledged. Nicholas stepped off the boat and crouched down. Theo looked at him with the gravity of a magistrate hearing testimony. "To stay," he said. "Da stays," Nicholas said. Theo appeared to accept this as a ratification of something already decided. He released Demi's hand and walked with the slightly authoritative bearing of a toddler who has made his position clear toward the path back to the compound. Nicholas straightened and looked at Sera. Something moved in his expression that she'd stopped trying to categorize and started simply registering the way you registered the weather. Present notable a factor in how things would proceed. "What did he just do?" Sera said. "I believe," Nicholas said, "that my son determined the meeting went well and is therefore heading back to more important matters." Sera looked at Theo's retreating form. "He's going back to the olive trees," she said. "He has priorities. He's 18 months old and he has more dignity than most adults I know." Nicholas looked at her for a moment. "He gets that from you." Sera stared at him. He walked after Theo. She stood on the dock for a moment with the water behind her and the island in front of her, and the afternoon light making everything look more certain than it was, and thought, this is what I came back to. Not safety, not certainty. This. A man walking after a toddler toward an olive tree. The absurd, specific, irreplaceable ordinary of it. She followed them inside. The next week passed with the specific quality of an in-between time. Not crisis, not resolution. The administrative aftermath of a decision that had been made the business of formalizing what had been agreed on in a room above a restaurant. Lawyers' documentation, the particular bureaucratic choreography of two criminal operations arranging a truce with enough paper around it to make violation costly for both sides. Nicholas spent his days in the compound's operations wing, and Sera spent hers in the residential wing with Theo, and they orbited each other in the evenings with the careful navigation of people who were figuring out new geography. It was the most domestic 2 weeks of Nicholas Drakos' adult life. He found himself learning things. He learned that Theo had a system for his toys. Not chaos, as it had first appeared, but a taxonomy known only to Theo in which objects were arranged by criteria Nicholas couldn't decode, but that Theo enforced with absolute conviction. Disturb the arrangement and you were corrected. Understand the arrangement and you were trusted. He learned that Sera made coffee with more care than anything else she did in the kitchen, standing at the machine with a particular focused attention, measuring, adjusting the temperature. The same precision she applied to clinical work applied to this completely inconsequential task. He found himself watching her do it and not explaining to himself why. He learned that she laughed differently when she was surprised by something than when she was amused by something she'd anticipated. The surprised laugh was shorter involuntary caught before it fully happened. The anticipated one came out slowly with warmth in it. He acknowledged to himself one morning in the operations wing, while reviewing documentation that required his full attention and considerable difficulty. Alex, who had stayed on the island for reasons he described as operational support, and which were transparently pretextual, found him on the terrace one evening and sat down without invitation. "You're watching her," Alex said. "I'm watching the water." "You're watching her through the window while she reads Theo a story." Alex poured himself wine from the bottle Nicholas had not offered him. "There's a distinction. There are multiple things in my visual field, one of which is significantly more interesting to you than the others." Alex drank. "What's the problem?" "There's no problem. You're doing the thing where you process something for twice as long as necessary because you're afraid of making a mistake." Alex set down his glass. "What's the mistake you're afraid of?" Nicholas was quiet for a moment. "She ran from me once," he said. "Yes, because of who I am, what I do." He looked at the window. "Those things haven't changed." "Some of them have. Not enough." Alex considered this. She came back. She came back because Theo was dying. She stayed because the alternative was unsafe. Nicholas picked up his glass. "Those aren't the same as wanting to be here." "No," Alex agreed. They're not. He paused. But they're not what she's still doing. Have you noticed that she stopped planning her exit? Nicholas turned. In the first week, Alex said she was noting everything, routes, security rotations, where the boats were kept. Not to use them, she wasn't going to leave with Theo in a dangerous situation, but as a reflex, knowing where the door was. He tilted his head. She stopped doing that about 8 days ago. Nicholas looked at him. I notice things, Alex said. It's a family trait. He stood. Tell her, not as strategy, not as positioning. He picked up his wine. Just tell her. He went inside. Nicholas sat with the Saronic dark and the wine going warm in his hand and thought about doors and the particular moment when someone stops needing to know where they are. He found Sera in Theo's room an hour later. Theo was asleep. The story finished, and Sera was sitting in the chair beside the crib with a book open in her lap that she wasn't reading. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway. He crossed the room and sat on the floor beside her chair. She looked at him, slightly startled. He didn't normally sit on floors. I need to say something, he said. Okay. When you left 18 months ago, he stopped. Started again with more precision. When you left, I told myself it was about the security risk, the operational liability of someone who knew too much and had gone off grid. He looked at the crib at Theo's sleeping face. That was a lie, I told myself. Sera was quiet. The actual situation, he said, is that I spent 8 months looking for you because I couldn't figure out how to stop thinking about you. And when every lead went cold, I told myself you were either dead or you'd made a clean decision, and I should respect it. And when you called, he paused. I was in my study when you called. I'd been in my study for 3 hours, not doing anything productive. I hadn't been doing anything productive for about 6 months. Sera was looking at him. I'm telling you this, he said, because you asked me once if there was anything in what's happening between us that wasn't strategic. And I said it was both the strategy and the genuine thing. He met her eyes. It's not both. The genuine thing was always there. The strategy is what I layered over it so I didn't have to be responsible for how much I was affected by you being here. Silence. Nicholas, she said, I know it's complicated. I know the timeline and the circumstances and the very legitimate reasons you have for not trusting this at face value. I'm not asking you to respond to it right now. He stood. I just needed to say it outside of a tactical context. He moved toward the door. Nicholas. Her voice stopped him. He turned. Sera was standing. She looked at him with the expression she used when she was deciding something. The nurses read the assessment, the deliberate gathering of information before commitment. Then she crossed the room and stood in front of him and put her hand flat against his chest, the way she'd done on the dock of the estate the night Theo's fever broke, steadying herself, grounding the contact. I know, she said quietly. I've known for a while. His hand came up over hers. I'm not ready to name it yet, she said. What it means. What we are. I need more time to trust that it's real, and not just what the situation requires. That's fair. But I'm not planning to leave. She met his eyes. I stopped planning it a while ago. I thought you should know that. His hand tightened over hers. I do know, he said. They stood like that for a moment in Theo's room with the sea outside and the island quiet around them, and then Sera stepped back and he let her, and she looked at him once more with the expression she had when she was deciding to trust something. Good night, she said. Good night. He went to his room. He lay awake for a long time with the particular quality of wakefulness that isn't sleeplessness, but awareness. The body registering that something has shifted, that the geometry of the situation has changed, in a way that makes stillness feel different than it did before. Outside, the island held its watch. In the crib, Theo slept with his arms flung wide, and somewhere in the east wing, Sera Voss was either awake or asleep, and both options felt to Nicholas Drakos like something he was grateful to be uncertain about. The documentation was signed 11 days after the second meeting. It happened in the end without theater, a neutral office and a law firm with ties to both operations. 2 sets of advisors, a table with water on it, 2 signatures on the same page. Vassos arrived 5 minutes after Nicholas. They shook hands before sitting down. The lawyers read. Both men signed. The lawyers gathered the papers. Vassos said on the way out, Tell your son about the olive trees when he's older, the ones on the island. He said it to Sera, not to Nicholas. Children who know something about patience, they turn out better. Sera thought about this on the boat ride back. She thought about it in the way she thought about things that didn't have an immediate use, filing it, letting it work on her, waiting to see what it produced. What it produced by the time the island rose out of the water ahead of them was a specific, settled knowledge she had not imagined the man she'd chosen to stay for. He was real and complicated and imperfect and trying, and the trying was visible in ways it hadn't been before, and that was what mattered. Theo was on the dock again. She was starting to suspect Demi was letting him get there on purpose. He saw the boat and bounced twice rapidly with the restrained excitement of someone who has been told to stay behind the dock marker and is taking that seriously while communicating under significant pressure. Nicholas stepped off first and crouched down. Theo grabbed his face with both hands, the way he did when he needed to make sure of something, and looked at him very directly. "Da," he said. "Yes," Nicholas said. Theo appeared satisfied. He released his father's face and turned to Sera with the same focused gravity. She crouched down. He put his hands on her face too. "Mama home," he said. Her throat tightened. "Mama home," she agreed. Theo nodded. He'd confirmed what he needed to confirm. He turned and walked back up the dock path toward the compound with the dignified authority of someone whose expectations have been met. Nicholas looked at Sera. She looked at him. They were crouched on the dock of an island compound off the Saronic Gulf, with their son walking ahead of them, and the arrangement that had been threatening them was signed, and the evening light was doing something specific to the water, and there was nothing immediate to resolve. "He's going to the olive trees," Nicholas said. "Obviously. Do you think he's going to actually feed them something today, or just attempt another bark investigation?" "I think he's going to attempt to climb one. He's been measuring them with his eyes for 3 days." Nicholas stood and offered her a hand up. She took it. He didn't release it right away. "He's going to succeed," Nicholas said. "He's been patient about it." Sera looked at their joined hands. "Yeah," she said softly. "He has." They walked up the dock path together after their son toward the compound and the olive trees and the evening and whatever came next. 2 months had passed since Sera Voss had dialed a number she'd kept for 18 months without using. The compound on Stavri had changed. Not structurally. The walls were still concrete and the gate still required 3 levels of clearance, and Petro still appeared when you needed him with the uncanny timing of someone who had made himself indispensable enough to afford invisibility. But the operational weight of it had shifted. The meetings that had once dominated Nicholas's schedule had thinned. The ones that remained were different in character, more administrative than strategic, the mechanics of a transition that was still in progress but visibly underway. Alex came to the island every week now. He told Nicholas it was because he liked the water. He told Sera it was because he liked watching his brother learn to be a person. "Is there a difference?" Sera asked him one afternoon. "Large," Alex said. "Nicholas running an operation is one of the most competent things I've ever witnessed. Nicholas figuring out how to eat dinner with his family is one of the most earnest things I've ever witnessed. I find it deeply affecting." "He'd hate hearing you describe it that way." "I know," Alex grinned. "That's also part of the appeal." Theo, who had been listening to this exchange from his current position on the garden path with a handful of small stones he was distributing according to a system only he understood, looked up and said, "Le," which was his name for Alex, and returned to his work. Alex looked at Sera with the expression of someone who had been named and found it entirely acceptable. "He acknowledges me," Alex said. "He acknowledges everything," Sera said. "He's building a taxonomy. Of stones. Of everything." Alex watched Theo for a moment. "He's going to be extraordinary." "He already is," Sera said. "We're just learning how to keep up." The honest truth in the space of that 2 months was that Nicholas Dracos was keeping up. He was doing it in the specific way of a man who was good at learning things when he accepted them as things worth learning, with complete attention and the willingness to be observed in the process of not yet knowing which was, in Sera's experience, the hardest part for most people, and the part he'd surprised her with most. He was learning his son. Not in the abstract, not in the we will provide for and protect version of learning that she'd half expected from a man who'd spent his life managing assets, but in the particular physical specific way of learning another person. The way Theo's mood presented in the morning, the vocabulary Theo was currently adding to, the things that made him laugh versus the things that made him go serious and focused. The exact combination of circumstances that predicted a meltdown and the specific approach low voice offer of a clear choice presence without pressure that could sometimes avert one. Nicholas had figured out the meltdown approach on his own through observation and trial. He told her about it one evening with the precise satisfaction of someone who had solved a problem they'd taken seriously. "You gave him choices," Sera had said. "He needs to feel like there's a path he can take," Nicholas had said. "He gets overwhelmed when it seems like there's only one outcome." A pause. I understand the feeling. Sera had looked at him. He'd looked back. I know, she'd said. They were getting good at those conversations, the ones that said more than they appeared to, and were acknowledged by both parties without being named. It was a different intimacy from the one she'd had with him 3 years ago, when everything had been immediate and she'd been too close to see the shape of it. This one was slower, more considered, more mutual, more hers. She was practicing nursing again. 3 days a week, she went to a small clinic on the mainland, vetted, secured, arranged through channels that were not entirely above board, but were staffed by people who understood that her situation was complicated and her skills were real. She treated patients. She was very good at it. She came home with the specific exhaustion of a person who has spent a day doing something that matters, and Nicholas always noticed the difference in her when she came back, and he always said nothing about it except sometimes where she'd been and how it had gone, which was exactly the right amount of space. It was not a simple life. It was not a safe life in the way that truly ordinary lives were safe. There were still threat assessments and security rotations and decisions made in the operations wing that she wasn't told about and didn't ask to be told about. Not because she couldn't handle them, but because there were borders she had agreed to maintain, a demarcation between the parts of his world she was part of and the parts she wasn't. And that demarcation was something they'd negotiated, and she found she trusted it. The trust was the thing. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. It arrived in increments, the way recovery arrived slowly, and then all at once, and then consistently, until you looked back and realized you couldn't identify the specific moment things had changed, because the change had been so gradual, it had become indistinguishable from who you were. She trusted him with Theo. That had happened first in the first days, almost without her permission. She trusted him with her presence on the island, that what she had agreed to was real, that the doors were as open as he'd said they were, that the control that was still there was deployed toward the ends. She could see, and not toward ones she couldn't. She knew now, beginning to trust him with herself. That was the last and hardest one, but she was working on it. On both sides of the door, she'd been deciding whether to walk through for 8 weeks. She would get there. She already had in certain lights. The first time Theo got hurt on Nicholas's watch, it was a Tuesday. Nothing serious. A tumble off the low garden wall he'd been climbing for 3 days, the one Sera had been monitoring with the calculated tolerance of a parent who understood that preventing all falls was less important than teaching a child how to land. She'd been at the clinic. Nicholas had been in the garden. Theo had made his move at the precise moment Nicholas was answering a call from the Piraeus shipping office, which was not. Theo apparently felt a sufficient reason to delay the experiment. He made it halfway up before the wall decided otherwise. Nicholas was beside him before Theo registered he'd fallen. The boy sat on the garden path looking at his palms with the expression of someone conducting a damage assessment, and then looked up at Nicholas, and then looked at his palms again. He did not cry. He showed Nicholas his hands with the solemn gravity of a person presenting evidence. I see, Nicholas said. He crouched down. Small scrapes, the skin barely broken, the kind that stung rather than bled. He examined them with the same precision he applied to everything. Does it hurt? Theo considered the question with intellectual honesty. A bit, he said. His vocabulary had expanded significantly in the past 2 months. He deployed new words with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood that language was a tool and tools should be used correctly. A bit, Nicholas agreed. He turned Theo's hands over, checked the other side, confirmed the structural integrity of the wrists. You need soap and water and something from the medical kit. And a plaster, Theo said. He had developed a strong attachment to plasters. Their necessity, in his view, was not strictly proportional to the severity of the injury. And a plaster, Nicholas said. He carried Theo inside and cleaned the scrapes with the methodical competence that was, Demi told Sera later, with considerable satisfaction, completely indistinguishable from the way a person who had been cleaning children's scrapes for years would do it. He applied 2 plasters. Theo inspected them, declared them acceptable, and asked for juice. Nicholas gave him juice. When Sera came home that afternoon, she found them both in the sitting room. Theo displaying his plasters to anyone who would look. Nicholas on the couch with a report he was not actually reading. He fell, Nicholas said. I know, Demi texted. She set down her bag and crouched to examine Theo's presented hands. Well done, she said to the plasters. Da fixed it, Theo said. I can see that. She looked up at Nicholas. He was watching her with the expression he used when he was waiting to find out if he'd done something wrong. He was fine, Nicholas said. I had eyes on him. I know. She stood. You can't catch every fall. I was on a call. Nicholas? She met his gaze. He's going to fall. That's what he does. You were there, you handled it. He's fine and very pleased about his plasters. She paused. You did well. The expression on his face at that, the fractional shift, the thing he didn't let become visible, but that she'd learned to read, was the expression of someone who had been waiting for a verdict that came back better than anticipated. He wanted two, Nicholas said. He only needed one. He always wants two. Standard. She went to the kitchen. How was the Piraeus call? Productive. He followed her. The corridor transition is ahead of schedule. Good. She started coffee. Vassos's people. Cooperative. Annoying but cooperative. She looked at him over her shoulder. There's a difference between annoying and problematic. I'm aware of the distinction. He leaned against the counter. He's not problematic. He made an arrangement and he's honoring it. The annoying part is purely personality. Can you work with personality? I do it regularly. A pause. You're here, aren't you? Sera turned. He said it with the exact delivery of someone who had considered and then decided to commit to the joke, not his natural register, but something he'd learned was available to him. Something that hadn't been there 3 years ago. That was almost charming, she said. Almost. You're getting there. He looked at her with the particular quality of attention he used when she said something he was deciding whether to respond to. I'm aware I'm a work in progress, he said. We all are. She poured coffee, handed him a cup. That's not a criticism. They stood in the kitchen that they had somehow and incrementally made theirs and drank coffee, and Theo appeared in the doorway with his plasters held up for renewed appreciation, and Nicholas said, still there, and Theo nodded, confirmed, and disappeared again. He's going to try that wall again tomorrow, Nicholas said. Yes. I'll spot him this time. Good. She drank her coffee. He'll make it. Probably. He's persistent. He is, Nicholas said, and looked at her with something in his expression that was not about Theo. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at her coffee. He's going to be on the wall all morning, she said. I have a clinic shift at 9. I'll be in the garden. Then it'll be fine. She went to change out of her clinic clothes, and she took the warmth in her chest with her, and didn't examine it too carefully, but didn't put it away either. The thing she hadn't told Nicholas was that she'd been offered a permanent position, not at the vetted clinic at Evangelismos Hospital, 40 minutes from the island by boat and car, one of Athens's primary trauma centers. Real ER work, full rotation. The offer had come through a contact she'd built over the past 2 months, someone who'd seen her work at the clinic and had made inquiries. It was everything she'd wanted before she'd run, everything she'd been training for when she'd taken the private nursing position that had put her in Nicholas's household 3 years ago. The private work had been meant to be temporary, a bridge away to save money while she waited for a hospital position to open. She'd been sitting with the offer for 4 days. The difficulty was not whether she wanted it. She wanted it with the particular clarity of wanting that had nothing ambiguous in it. The wanting that was simply knowledge. Yes, this is the right thing. The difficulty was the conversation it required. She had told Nicholas in the first days on the island that she needed to work, that it was a condition of her cooperation, that she had a right to practice medicine, that any arrangement between them had to include this. He had agreed. She had been working at the clinic for 2 months, and he had been, as promised, supporting it without managing it, arranging the security without inserting himself into her professional relationships, trusting her to assess her own safety, not asking questions she didn't offer answers to. The hospital was different in degree, not in kind. More exposure, more time off the island, more contact with people and systems that were outside his control. She knocked on the operations wing door on a Thursday evening. He looked up from his desk. You're not usually here. No. She sat. I need to talk to you about something. He set down his papers. She told him about the offer. All of it. The hospital, the position, what it meant professionally, the timeline. She told him what the security complications would look like and what she'd already thought through about how to manage them, because she'd been thinking about it for 4 days, and she knew his mind well enough now to come prepared. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You've already decided, he said. I'm asking you how you feel about it. You've already decided, he said again, not accusingly. You wouldn't have prepared the security analysis if you were still deciding. She held his gaze. Yes, I've already decided. I'm still asking. Another pause. The commute, he said, 40 minutes each way. On call rotations, you'd sometimes need to leave before dawn. Yes. Yes. The exposure at the hospital, colleagues, patients, visitors, any number of people Petros can't vet in advance. Yes. And you've thought through how to manage that? Mostly. I have some gaps I'd want Petros's input on. Nicholas turned his chair slightly, looking at the window rather than at her. It was what he did when he was processing something he didn't want to process in front of anyone, finding an angle of approach that let him think without being watched. Thinking. You'd be good at it, he said finally. Yes. The ER. You'd be very good at it. He turned back. You already are, and that's a smaller stage. She waited. Take the position, he said. The words were unequivocal. No caveat attached, no conditional, no qualifier that would require negotiation. She looked at him. I told you I was working on it, he said. The letting go. This is what that looks like. He held her gaze. You're a trauma nurse. That's who you are. I don't get to wall that off because it would make my security parameters simpler. It is going to make the parameters more complex. Yes. He almost smiled. That's the cost of having someone worth protecting. Sera looked at him for a long moment. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me for agreeing to something I should have agreed to without hesitation. He picked up his papers. Talk to Petros about the gaps. He'll be thorough. She stood. Nicholas? Yes. She looked at him across the desk, at the man she'd run from, the man she'd come back to. The man she was still learning every day was more than either the version she'd feared or the version she'd hoped for. I know it's not easy, she said. The letting go. I know it goes against how you're built. Many things worth doing go against how I'm built. He looked at her steadily. I'm getting better at doing them anyway. She nodded. She left the operations wing and walked back to the residential wing through the covered walkway, and the island was quiet around her, and the evening was warm, and she thought, I don't think I'm going to leave this. Not the compound, not the island, not the complicated, imperfect, still unfinished arrangement she'd built with the most controlled man she'd ever met in her life, and their son, who fed crackers to olive trees. She thought, I think this might be home. She was not ready to say it out loud yet, but she knew it the way she knew diagnoses before the test results, before the confirmation in the specific moment when the evidence aligned into something she couldn't honestly misread. She went to find Theo. He was in the sitting room doing the thing he did sometimes in the evenings when he'd been outside all day, and the quiet settled in, sitting in the middle of the floor with his small collection of stones around him, in their arrangement humming to himself, entirely content. She sat on the floor beside him. He leaned against her without looking up, the absent, complete lean of a child who knows exactly where the warmth is. She put her arm around him and looked at his stones. The big one goes there, he said, moving a piece. Does it? Yes. He considered the arrangement. It has to be in the middle. Why? Because, Theo said with the certainty of someone for whom this was obvious, it's the important one. Sera looked at the stone in the middle of his arrangement. Dark gray, slightly flattened, unremarkable in any objective sense. How do you know it's the important one? She asked. Theo looked at her with the expression he used when adults ask questions he found puzzling in their simplicity. Because I chose it, he said. She held him tighter. Yeah, she said softly. That's how you know. The first night Sera stayed at the hospital for an emergency rotation, a multi-vehicle accident that had come in at 2 in the morning and required all hands through to dawn, she came home to find Nicholas awake. He was in the kitchen, coffee made. He looked up when she came through the door, and his expression did the thing it did when he'd been managing something internally and was releasing the management. You could have texted, she said. I know. I did text. I said it was running long. I know. He poured her coffee. Sit down. She was exhausted in the specific way of a post-trauma shift, the body spent, and the mind still running residual adrenaline. She sat. How many he asked. The accident, 6 patients. 2 critical. 1 we lost on arrival. She wrapped her hands around the cup. The other one made it. 54 years old, bilateral chest trauma. We had him in surgery within 20 minutes. A pause. He's going to be okay. Nicholas watched her. Do you always know, he said, right at the beginning, whether someone is going to make it? Sometimes, not always. She drank her coffee. The ones you can't read are the hardest. Because you don't know how to calibrate. Because there's hope, and hope has a cost. She set down the cup. When you know they're not going to make it, you shift to making it as good as possible. When you don't know, you hold 2 states at once. That's exhausting. He was quiet for a moment. I know the feeling. She looked at him. I held 2 states at once for 8 months, he said. Looking for you, telling myself I didn't know what I'd find. She understood what he was saying, what the parallel meant. But you kept looking, she said. Yes, that's the difference, she said softly, between hope and the other thing. The keeping going. Nicholas reached across the counter and put his hand over hers. Not more than that. Not less than that. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat in the kitchen in the early morning light, the island just beginning to show gray beyond the window, her hand in his and the question she'd been living inside for months. What this was, what they were. What she was willing to name felt suddenly less like a question and more like something she already knew the answer to. She just hadn't said it yet. How's Theo? She asked. Asleep. He stayed up until 9 asking where you were. I told him the hospital needed you. What did he say? He said, Mama fix people. And then he went to sleep. She closed her eyes. Yeah, she said. That's about right. Nicholas's hand tightened over hers. Go sleep, he said. He'll be up at 6 and he's going to want a full report. She stood and she was tired and she stood there for a moment with his hand still holding hers and the morning coming in through the window. Nicholas, she said. Yes. She looked at him. At the specific face she'd spent 3 years knowing in different registers, the guarded one, the controlled one. The one he wore in the dark, at 2 in the morning when he thought he was alone. The one he wore when Theo showed him something important like a handful of bark or 2 plasters on small hands. I think I love you, she said. I've been working up to saying it for a while. He was very still. I think, she said. I'm about 90% certain. The remaining 10% is that it still scares me a little. What does the remaining 10% need? He said. His voice was very quiet. Time, she said, which you've been giving me. She paused, and probably just to say it out loud and see what happens. What happens, Nicholas said, is that I've been in love with you since you sat in my foyer 3 years ago and told me that my schedule was unreasonable and you were going to reorganize it. He held her gaze. I didn't have language for it then. I do now. She looked at him for a long time. Then, your schedule was unreasonable. It was, he agreed. You were right. She came around the counter. She kissed him the way you kiss someone you'd been deciding to kiss for a long time. Not desperately, not dramatically, but with the full deliberate presence of a choice being made and owned. His hands came to her face, careful and certain, and she held his jacket and stood on her toes and let it be what it was. Complete, unhurried, real. When they stepped back, the morning had arrived properly. Gold and clear, and coming in through the kitchen window with the specific beauty of early light on water. You should sleep, he said. I should, she agreed. She didn't immediately move. I know, he said, and his thumbs brushed her cheekbones, and she understood that the sentence was complete without an object, that he knew the things she hadn't finished saying, and she knew the things he hadn't either. She went to bed. She fell asleep within minutes. She slept more deeply than she had in 18 months. 3 weeks after the morning in the kitchen, Nicholas told her about the house. Not on the island, a house in Athens proper. A neighborhood called Kifisia in the northern suburbs. Old trees and quiet streets, and the specific unhurried quality of a place that had been residential long enough to feel established. 3 bedrooms, a garden, a school 2 streets away that had Petros confirmed an excellent reputation and manageable security parameters. Nicholas produced the key. The way he produced most things directly without ceremony, setting it on the kitchen table during breakfast while Theo was engaged in a complex negotiation with his yogurt. Sera looked at the key. You bought a house, she said. The island is secure, Nicholas said. It will remain our primary residence for the foreseeable future. But the island isn't... He paused. It's not ordinary enough. For him. He looked at Theo. He needs ordinary. School and neighbors and the ability to fall off things without a security team in the background. Sera looked at the key. It's in your name, Nicholas said. Completely separate from my business holdings. If you want to live there full-time, with or without me, that's your choice. If you want it as a place we go together weekends, holidays, whenever the situation allows, that works too. A pause. I'm not managing the outcome. I'm giving you the option. She picked up the key. When did you do this? She said. 6 weeks ago. I had Alex handle it, so there was no direct connection to me. 6 weeks ago, we'd been here for a month. Yes? She turned the key in her hand. You were already... I was already building toward the possibility, he said carefully, that you'd stay, that it would be real. He met her gaze. I was aware that building toward it didn't make it certain, but I was doing it anyway. She looked at him for a long moment. That was optimistic of you, she said. I prefer strategic, he said, but the word doesn't change what it was. Theo looked up from his yogurt. He had somehow acquired yogurt on his ear. Key? He said, pointing at Sera's hand with the authority of someone who recognized objects of interest. It's a house key, Sera said. House, Theo repeated. He looked at Nicholas. Our house. The question landed with the clean simplicity of a child who had no access to the layers of it. The weeks of careful circling approached the 18 months of separation that preceded it. The complicated particular love of two people who'd found their way to each other through fear and distance and the accumulated weight of better choices. Nicholas looked at Theo, then at Sera. Yes, he said. Our house. Theo nodded, satisfied. He returned to his yogurt. Sera closed her hand around the key. Okay, she said. She didn't try to make it sound small. It wasn't small. Okay, let's go see it. They went on a Saturday, the three of them in the boat, and then the car Petros driving Alex in the front seat, having invited himself along on the grounds that he was emotionally invested in the outcome. Theo stood on Nicholas's lap for the boat portion and pointed at things on the water and narrated them with considerable expertise. Kefisha was leafy and quiet in the late morning. The house was on a street where the trees were old enough that their roots had pushed up sections of the pavement, the particular evidence of something that had been there long enough to change its environment. The building itself was modest by the standards of what Nicholas might have bought 2 stories. White walls, green shutters, a wisteria climbing the front that had the overgrown, slightly anarchic quality of something that had been planted by someone else and was currently doing whatever it wanted. Theo looked at the wisteria with immediate professional interest. Come easy. Can he climb it? Nicholas said to Sera. Not yet, Sera said. Maybe in a year. It'll be there, Nicholas said. She looked at him. He was looking at the house with an expression she'd seen before, only once in a different context. The expression he'd worn when he'd first seen Theo clearly in the apartment in Kypseli, standing in a doorway with understanding arriving in his face like weather. The look of someone encountering something they hadn't known they were missing. What? She said. I've never... He stopped. Reconsidered. I've had houses, buildings, properties. He looked at the green shutters, the overgrown wisteria, the roots pushing up the pavement. This is different. It's smaller, she said. Yes, less defensible, significantly. Noisier neighborhood. I expect so. She looked at the house, at the green shutters and the wisteria, and the school 2 streets away, and the ordinary, imperfect, irreplaceable quality of a place where a child could grow up without learning too early what he had to be protected from. It's good, she said. Yes, Nicholas said, it is. Alex produced a bottle of wine from somewhere and announced that the occasion merited celebration and possibly also lunch, and Theo attempted to climb the wisteria with immediate consequence, and Petros stood at the perimeter with the stoic patience of someone who had learned to accept that his principal's life now included a toddler, and the Saturday settled in around them warm and specific and real. This was what they had built, not by design, not according to any plan either of them had made at the beginning of this. She hadn't planned to call him. He hadn't planned to have a son. Neither of them had planned for the island or the arrangement with Vassos or the kitchen at 4 a.m, or any of the specific irreplaceable moments that had accumulated into a life. They had built it the way most real things were built, by showing up, by not running, by making the harder choice again and again until the choice stopped feeling hard and started feeling like who they were. Sera stood in front of the house with the key in her hand and her son trying to climb a wisteria and the man she loved standing beside her close enough that their shoulders touched, and thought, we made this. Not from nothing. From everything they'd survived to get here. That was better than nothing. That was, she thought, just about everything. The night they first stayed in the Kefisya house was 4 weeks after she'd first seen it. They'd spent those 4 weeks going back and forth island during the week, the house on weekends when her schedule allowed and Nicholas's operations permitted the reduced security of a civilian neighborhood. Theo adapted to the new geography with the characteristic ease of someone who had been moving his whole life and understood homes to be where the people you loved were, rather than any specific set of walls. He had a room in the Kefisya house painted the color of a clear sky. He had asked for it. Nicholas had arranged it the same week. The first night they all stayed there properly, bags unpacked. Theo in his blue room, the house smelling of fresh paint, and the wisteria coming in through the window Sera had left open. Nicholas stood in the doorway of the main bedroom and looked at the room with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Exposed, unguarded, present in the specific way of someone who has arrived somewhere they didn't know they were going. "Are you all right?" she said. "Yes." He looked at her. "I'm trying to determine what this is." "What do you think it is?" He was quiet for a moment. "It's the first time in my adult life that I've stood in a room and didn't know exactly what the next thing would require of me." He looked at the bed, the window, the ordinary, unheroic domesticity of a bedroom in a house in Kephysia. "It's strange." Good strange or bad strange? He considered this with genuine care. "Good," he said finally. "Deeply unfamiliar, but good." She took his hand. "Come to bed." "Theo is asleep. I checked twice." She looked at him. "He's in his blue room. He's fine. Come to bed." He let her lead him. They lay in the dark with the wisteria moving outside the window and the neighborhood's quiet sounds coming through a dog somewhere. A late car. The ordinary music of a place that didn't know anything important was happening inside the house on the corner. And Sera thought about 18 months in a series of small apartments, counting respirations, making plans that required never being found. She thought about Theo's fever and the number she'd been keeping for 18 months without dialing. She thought about this man beside her still in the dark, with a quality of stillness that was different now from the controlled stillness she'd known before that was rest instead of vigilance, that was someone choosing to be present in the particular place where he was. "Nicholas," she said, "I love you." The remaining 10% had resolved itself somewhere in the last 3 weeks. Not 90, all of it. Silence. His arm came around her. "I know," he said, and the warmth in it was complete and certain and entirely his. She settled against him. Outside, the wisteria moved in the night wind. Inside, Theo slept in his blue room, unafraid the way children slept when the people who loved them had figured things out. The complications arrived as they always did without announcement. It was a Tuesday in November, 4 months after Sera had first called him from Kypseli. The hospital shift had ended normally. Petros had collected her from the hospital entrance. The car had been swept that morning, the route to the boat had been clear. She was reading something on her phone when Petros said, "We're making a detour." She looked up. "Why?" "Precautionary." He caught her eyes in the mirror. "Mr. Dracos will explain." She put the phone down. The detour took them to a marina on the eastern side of the city rather than the usual embarkation point. Nicholas was there, standing at the dock with Petros's deputy, dressed in the dark suit he wore when things required the version of him that made rooms go quiet. She got out of the car. "What happened?" she said. "One of Vassos's men made contact with our shipping office today," Nicholas said. "Not through the agreed channels, directly in person to one of my logistics managers. Is that a violation?" "Potentially. The arrangement specifies agreed channels for operational communication. This was outside them." He was watching her with the expression that meant he was calibrating how much to tell her. She'd learned to recognize that expression and to respond to it. "Don't do that," she said. "The calibrating. Tell me what you actually know." A pause. The message was ambiguous. It might be a test of the arrangement, Vassos checking whether I'll respond to a provocation. It might be a genuine communication from someone who didn't understand the agreed protocols. It might be something more significant. He met her gaze. "Until I know which I want you on the island." "Theo, already there. Alex picked him up from the house this afternoon." She absorbed this. "He's okay. He's fine. He and Alex are apparently building something out of cardboard boxes. There's been significant structural ambition." The tension in her chest eased fractionally. "Okay," she said. "Island. And then what?" "And then I meet with Vassos's primary representative tomorrow morning and get clarity." He looked at her directly. "Sera, this may be nothing. The arrangement is held for 4 months. Vassos is practical. He knows the cost of violating it. And if it's not nothing, then we respond to what it actually is with the information we actually have, and we don't catastrophize ahead of the facts." He paused. "That's your advice applied to my situation." She looked at him. "When did I say that?" 3 weeks ago. The hospital patient you couldn't read." He held her gaze. "You said you couldn't treat a diagnosis you hadn't confirmed." She had said that. She remembered. "All right," she said. "Island. You go to the meeting. We get clarity." "Yes." And if clarity turns out to be something we need to respond to, then we respond to it together, he said, as we agreed. She looked at him across the dock in the November dark, the water moving behind him, the city at his back. You're not afraid, she said. Of Vassos. A pause. I'm concerned. That's different. What are you concerned about? He was quiet for a moment. That I've made something real here, he said. And real things are things that can be damaged. He looked at her steadily. That's new for me, the having something that can be damaged. She understood what he was saying. She crossed the dock and put her hand against his chest. It's not going to be damaged, she said. You don't know that. No. She looked up at him. But you built walls around it that could stop a naval assault, so I feel reasonably confident. The corner of his mouth moved. Come on, she said. Take me to the island. We'll find out what Theo and Alex built. He put his hand over hers briefly. It had flags, he said. Alex mentioned flags. Of course it did. They got in the boat. The island was lit and quiet when they arrived. The security, at its standard rotation, the residential wing warm, and the smell of dinner coming from the kitchen. Alex met them at the dock with the expression of someone who had managed a successful afternoon and was aware of it. He's magnificent, Alex said. The structure. He made me add a turret. Theo appeared behind Alex's legs. He'd been awake past his usual time and had the slightly glassy, sustained quality of a child running on willpower rather than energy. He made a beeline for Sera, then for Nicholas, assessing each of them with the thoroughness of someone checking that everything was where he'd left it. Satisfied, he said, "Castle," and pointed back toward the sitting room. I've heard, Nicholas said. Come see, Theo said, with the authority of someone who did not consider this optional. They went to see the castle. It was, Alex had not been wrong. Magnificent, a construction of flattened boxes and tape, and 2 dish towels serving as flags taller than Theo by a significant margin with the slightly precarious quality of something that had been engineered beyond its materials. Nicholas crouched down and examined it with the specific gravity he'd learned to apply to Theo's work. The turret, he said. My idea, Theo said. He pointed at the top. Strong. It is, Nicholas said. Very. I built it, Theo said. Then with the precision of a person who believed in accurate attribution, Alex helped. Alex was honored to help, Alex said. Nicholas looked at the castle, then at Theo, then briefly at Sera. Whatever had been concerning him on the dock, the message through wrong channels, the uncertainty, the new and unfamiliar fear of damaged things, it was still there. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. It hadn't resolved. But he looked at his son's cardboard castle, and something in him settled a fraction. Good engineering, he said to Theo. Theo beamed. Later, after Theo was asleep and Alex had retreated to the guest wing and Petros had confirmed the island perimeter twice, Sera found Nicholas on the terrace. He was standing at the rail looking at the dark water, the particular stillness of someone holding a calculation. She stood beside him. You'll find out tomorrow, she said. Yes, and whatever it is, we'll deal with it. Yes? She looked at the water. He built a castle today, with flags. He did. He's going to do things like that every day for the rest of his life, she said. That's not going to stop being available to you. Whatever Vassos does or doesn't do, Theo, is going to build things and show you and ask you to come see. Nicholas was quiet. That's the thing that can't be damaged, she said. The rest we can protect or rebuild or work around. She looked at the light inside the sitting room where the castle stood in the dark. That's the permanent part. He turned to look at her. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and they stood at the rail in the November dark and let the island hold them. I know, he said. Good. Thank you. You don't have to thank me. I know that too. He pressed his lips to her hair. I'm choosing to. The water moved in the dark. The perimeter held. The castle stood in the sitting room with its flags. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. Tonight there was the island and the dark and the warm weight of someone beside you who had chosen to stay. That was enough. It was more than enough. The meeting with Vassos's representative was as Nicholas had allowed it might be nothing. A mid-level operative who had failed to understand the communication protocols. A genuine error poorly handled, corrected within 48 hours by Vassos himself, via a brief message through the agreed channel apology clarification confirmation that the arrangement remained in force. Nicholas returned to the island that afternoon and told Sera. She listened. Then she said good, and went back to the report she'd been reading from the hospital. He looked at her for a moment. That's all, he said. That's all, she agreed. It was nothing. We handled it. We moved on. She looked up. This is what normal looks like, Nicholas. Things come up. We deal with them. Life continues. He sat down. You're very calm about this, he said. I've been in a trauma bay. She set down the report. People arrive broken, and then they don't die, and then they go home. Things are terrible, and then they're better. You learn to hold the range of outcomes and keep working regardless. She looked at him. You do the same thing, you just call it something different. Risk management, he said. Yes. She picked up the report. Same thing, different vocabulary. He sat with this. Then he said, We're going to be all right. She looked at him over the report. We already are, she said. But Yolm. He nodded slowly. Outside somewhere in the garden, Theo was conducting further experiments. The sounds of it came through the window, small and decisive and completely themselves, the sounds of a child in full possession of an afternoon, unaware that the adults who loved him had spent the last 48 hours managing the particular fear of people who have learned what it is to have something worth protecting. Nicholas looked at the window. Then he stood and went outside to see what Theo had found. Sera watched him go. She waited until she heard Theo's voice rise in greeting, the specific sound of a child who has been absorbed in something and looked up to find someone worth looking up for. And then she smiled quietly to herself and went back to the report. This was what it was. Not simple. Not safe entirely. Not the life she'd planned before she'd ever walked into a marble foyer and been assessed by a pair of dark eyes and decided despite every reasonable instinct to stay. But it was hers. And his. And Theo's. And it was being built every day in the specific, unheroic, irreplaceable way of things that are real in hospital shifts and security rotations and cardboard castles with flags in kitchen conversations and terrace silences and plasters on small hands and keys on breakfast tables and a man learning to sit on the floor. In choosing again and again the harder and better thing. She finished the report. She went outside. Theo was showing Nicholas something in the dirt near the olive tree. Something Nicholas was receiving with the complete attention that was, she knew now, the most him thing about him. The willingness, when something mattered, to give it everything. She sat on the garden wall and watched them. The afternoon was warm and the island was quiet, and the sea was present beyond the garden's edge. And she thought, I dialed a number 3 months ago because my son was dying and I had no one else to call. She thought I didn't know when I dialed it that it was going to bring me here. She looked at the man crouching in the dirt beside her son. She thought, I'm glad I dialed it. I'm glad I stayed. She looked at the sea and the olive trees and the small figure of her son pointing at something urgent and necessary in the garden soil. She thought, this is home. And for the first time in 18 months, she let herself believe it completely. The proposal happened in the garden at Kifisia, not planned, or rather planned in the sense that Nicholas had been carrying the ring for 6 weeks, which was, in his view, not planning so much as readiness, keeping the possibility present until the right moment declared itself. He had learned in 5 months of being Theo's father and Sera's partner that the right moment was rarely the one you constructed in advance. It was the one you recognized when it arrived. It arrived on a Sunday morning in December, which was not a particularly dramatic month in Athens, gray and mild, rather than dramatic. The olive trees holding their color, the wisteria stripped to its winter architecture. Theo in his wellies in the Kifisia garden investigating what happened to worms in cold weather. Sera was on the bench with coffee watching him. Nicholas sat beside her. They were quiet for a while, as they were often quiet together now. A comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need filling, that had taken 5 months of accumulated shared experience to build. And that was in its way the thing he was most proud of achieving. Then Theo found a worm and held it up with both hands in the manner of someone making an announcement. And Sera made the specific sound she made when Theo did something that was both magnificent and slightly alarming. And Nicholas thought now. He reached into his pocket. The ring was simple. He had not wanted to make a statement about wealth or power, had wanted something she would wear without feeling like an emblem. A single stone, pale and clear, set in something that would last without being ostentatious. He had thought about it for longer than he thought anything in a very long time. He held it out. Sera looked at his hand, then at him. Nicholas, she said, I know the circumstances are unconventional, he said. I know we started badly, and the middle was complicated, and neither of us has a clean record on this. He held her gaze. I know you know who I am and what I come from. I know it would be easier to love someone whose life didn't require a security perimeter. It would, she agreed quietly. I know. he continued, that you stayed because of Theo first and chose to be here second, and I know there's a difference. He looked at the ring in his hand. I'm asking you to stay not because of him, or because of the threat, or because there's no other option. I'm asking because I want you here, because I'm better at existing when you're in it, because Theo is going to spend the rest of his life with two parents who either chose each other or didn't, and I want to choose you. Sera was very still. That's the simple version, he said. The less simple version is that I am not easy, and you know that, and you have stayed anyway, and I have been watching you stay and trying to deserve it. He paused. I'd like the chance to keep trying. She looked at the ring, then at him, then briefly at Theo, who had stopped investigating the worm and was watching them both with the attentive gravity of someone who sensed something significant was happening. What do you think? She said to Theo. Theo looked at Nicholas, then at the ring, then at his mother. Say yes, Theo said. He said it with the tone of someone stating the obvious. Sera looked at Nicholas. He said yes, Nicholas said. He's two, she said. His vote is enthusiastic but advisory. And yours? She held out her hand. He put the ring on. She looked at it for a moment, then she looked at him. And there was nothing hidden in her expression, no management, no calibration, just the full clear face of someone who had made a decision and meant it completely. Yes, she said. Obviously yes. He kissed her. Theo immediately climbed onto the bench between them and demanded attention, which was so characteristic of him that neither of them could maintain any solemnity about it. Nicholas held his son with one arm and Sera with the other, and the December garden settled around them, and this was how the morning continued. Theo investigating further worms, Sera making more coffee. Nicholas on his phone telling Alex, who responded with a voice message that was primarily congratulations and secondarily a reminder that he had called this 3 months ago and would like acknowledgement of this fact. The acknowledgement was not forthcoming. They were married in May. Not a large event, the island compound. The garden on the southern slope. 30 people who were either family or the small and specific selection of people who had earned that category over the years. Alex stood up for Nicholas. Petro stood at the perimeter with his stoic competence and what Sera privately believed was a very contained satisfaction. Demi cried. Theo was the ring bearer. He'd been practicing carrying the rings on a small cushion for 2 weeks, a responsibility he took with immense seriousness. He walked the garden path with the focused deliberateness of someone executing a complex task, looked up at the officiant with the ring cushion, and then in the manner of someone who had prepared for this and was prepared, said, "Here." Nicholas received the rings. Theo went to stand beside Alex, who gave him a cracker he'd been keeping in his pocket for exactly this eventuality. The vows were brief and direct, which was the version Sera had asked for, and Nicholas had been glad to agree to. They looked at each other with the particular attention of people who had learned to look at each other closely. They said what they meant. The officiant pronounced them married. Nicholas kissed her like they were the only people on the island. Theo tugged his sleeve. They broke apart. Nicholas looked down. Me too, Theo said. They kissed the top of his head simultaneously from both sides. He accepted this with dignity. 1 year later, the Kafisha house had been fully occupied for 8 months. The wisteria had come back aggressively in spring, as it apparently always did. Alex called it the annual offensive, and offered to help contain it, which Sera declined because she decided she liked its disregard for boundaries. The school 2 streets away had sent home in Theo's first week a note describing him as very engaged and occasionally definitive in his opinions, which Nicholas read 3 times and framed. Nicholas had not framed it, but he had kept it. The operations on Stavri were smaller than they'd been 2 years ago. The legitimate businesses, the shipping, the property holdings, the investment structures were carrying the weight now. The other things were being dismantled piece by piece, not dramatically, not with announcements, but in the specific manner of someone who was making something into what it needed to become. It would take time. He'd told Sera this from the beginning. She'd said then it takes time. Vassos was a known quantity. The arrangement held. They'd had 2 further conversations over the year, brief, practical, the communications of 2 operations managing a shared interest in avoiding conflict. His grandson had started school. Vassos had mentioned this once in passing at the end of an operational call. Nicholas had said Theo started school too. A pause. Then Vassos had said good. The call had ended. It was not friendship. It was not warmth. It was two old enemies choosing for reasons that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with what they had left to lose, not to be enemies anymore. Sera was at the hospital 4 days a week. She was, as Nicholas had known, she would be exceptional at it. She'd been involved in 2 research studies. She'd mentored 3 junior nurses who had taken to following her around the department with the specific devotion of people who had encountered someone who was genuinely good at something they wanted to learn. She came home from work and smelled of antiseptic and competence, and the particular slightly sad satisfaction of a person who had spent the day fixing things that could be fixed and sitting with things that couldn't. And Nicholas met her at the door, and she told him about her day, and he listened with the full attention that was the best thing about him. And they had dinner and put Theo to bed and sat on the terrace if the evening was warm enough, or in the sitting room if it wasn't, and they were ordinary together in the way that was the highest achievement of 2 people who had come to it through extraordinary things. They were happy. Nicholas knew this with the same precision he knew other facts about his world clearly, completely, without remainder. He had not expected to be happy in this way. He'd expected to be effective, capable, adequate to the demands of what he'd chosen. He'd expected to love his son. He'd expected to continue loving Sera with the particular painful accuracy he'd loved her with when she was gone. He had not expected it to feel like this, like arriving somewhere after a long transit, like the specific relief of a thing completed. He told her this one evening in October, a year into the life they'd built. They were on the Kefija terrace, the autumn city sounds coming over the garden wall. Theo asleep in his blue room. "I didn't know it felt like this," he said. "What does it feel like?" she said. He thought about it, like being built for something and finding out what it was. She looked at him with the expression she had when something landed exactly where it should. "Yeah," she said softly. "That's about right." She took his hand. They sat in the autumn evening and listened to the city and let the year settle around them this year that had started in an apartment in Kypseli with a phone call she'd been afraid to make, and had ended here a house with wisteria and a blue room and a ring on her hand, and a man who had learned slowly and imperfectly and completely to let himself be loved. "Nicholas," she said. "Yes, I'm glad I called." He looked at her. The October light made everything warm and specific. "So am I," he said. He turned her hand over in his and pressed his mouth to her palm briefly, the way he did sometimes not a gesture of romance so much as recognition, the acknowledgement of something present and real. She closed her fingers over it. Inside, Theo slept in his blue room, unafraid dreaming the absolute dreams of a child who was loved completely on all sides and had never been given reason to doubt it. Outside Athens continued being Athens complicated and ancient and imperfectly beautiful, the city that had swallowed Sera once when she was running and held Nicholas's empire and witnessed without fanfare the particular small miracle of 2 people building something real out of everything that should have broken them. The wisteria on the front wall had already begun in the warm October its advanced preparations for the spring offensive. Theo had told it could grow wherever it wanted. He had Nicholas noted his mother's instinct for what was worth the risk of letting go. He had his father's certainty about what was worth protecting. He was going to be magnificent. He already was. 5 years. Sera stood at the kitchen window of the Kefisia house watching Theo play in the garden. He was 7 now, all conversation and opinions, and the specific serious energy of a boy who had a lot of thoughts about how things should be done and wasn't shy about them. He had a friend from school with him today, a small girl named Phoebe, who seemed to take his organizational tendencies in stride, which was Sera felt the correct response, and probably also indicative of character. They were building something. Again, always. This time it appeared to involve a system of pulleys made of jump rope and sticks, the purpose of which Sera had not been able to determine, but which Theo had explained to her for 11 minutes with absolute confidence. Nicholas appeared beside her at the window. "He's got the engineering gene, he said. "He's got your certainty about systems, and your creative problem solving." She looked at him. "You said something nice about me without being prompted." "I've been working on that." "You have," she agreed. "You're getting good at it." He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him in the way she'd been leaning into him for 5 years. The automatic ease of 2 people whose bodies had learned each other's geography so thoroughly that it required no thought. Outside, Theo announced something to Phoebe. She appeared to agree. The pulley system lurched into operation. "It's not going to hold," Nicholas said. "No," Sera agreed, "but he'll learn something from when it doesn't. And then rebuild, obviously." They watched the pulley system perform its brief optimistic function, and then fail in the specific way of something that was excellent in theory and required refinement in practice. Theo stood looking at it for a moment. Phoebe said something. Theo nodded, already recalculating. "He's fine," Nicholas said. "He's completely fine," Sera agreed. She turned to look at Nicholas properly, fully, the way she did sometimes when she wanted to register something that was in danger of being taken for granted in the ordinary accumulation of daily life. At the face she'd known for 8 years and understood in new increments every year. At the man who had learned to sit on floors and eat dinner at tables and say "good morning" out loud, rather than nod and disappear into the operations wing, who had learned slowly, genuinely, at considerable cost to his characteristic certainty that some things got better when you stopped trying to control them. "I love you," she said. Not because it needed saying, because it was true and she believed in saying true things. He looked at her, the particular undistracted attention. "I know," he said. "You're supposed to say it back." "I love you." He said it with the directness of someone who had learned that it didn't diminish anything to say it out loud. "I've loved you since you reorganized my schedule and told me my habits were inefficient. I will love you until I stop having habits." That was almost romantic, she said. Almost. The corner of his mouth. "I'm still working on the delivery." She kissed him briefly in the kitchen of their house in Kifisia. Outside, Theo had already begun the rebuild. He moved with the specific, confident focus of someone who believed as a settled conviction that things could be made to work if you understood them clearly enough and didn't give up. He had been building things his whole life, castles and pulley systems, and earlier than anyone would have predicted a clear understanding of what mattered and what didn't. He was going to keep building, that was certain, and behind him in this window his parents stood close in the kitchen light, and the wisteria moved on the front wall, and the olive trees on the island held their ancient patience, and the Saronic Gulf lay quiet in the distance, and the city of Athens went on being Athens, ancient and imperfect, and full of people living their complicated lives. Among them, a nurse and a man who had spent years building walls and had learned finally that the best walls were the ones you chose to stand outside of together. Among them, a boy who had been born into their story before either of them had finished writing it, and who had turned out to be as Alex had predicted and Sera had known from his first breath. And Nicholas had understood the moment, a small hand pressed against his jaw, the best thing that had ever happened to either of them. Among them, a family, built from the wreckage of fear, built from 18 months of running and one phone call and a fever that broke before dawn, built from the specific, ordinary, irreplaceable materials of showing up again and again through all of it for each other. It was not the life either of them had planned. It was better than anything either of them had planned. It was theirs. The night of their 5th anniversary, Alex came for dinner. He always came for dinner when it was an occasion and when it wasn't actually, but this was an occasion. He brought wine and a gift for Theo that Sera immediately recognized as something that would result in mess and said so. Alex said that was the point. Theo agreed with Alex, which was becoming a pattern Sera had decided to simply accept as a feature of the existing architecture. They ate outside because May in Athens permitted it. The garden was full and green, the wisteria at its most optimistic, the late light making everything look like something from a photograph of a life you wanted to be inside. Theo held court at his end of the table, narrating something at length to Phoebe, who had become a permanent fixture of his landscape, and to Alex, who listened with the attentive sincerity of a man who found children genuinely interesting rather than performatively. Nicholas and Sera sat close together at the other end. 5 years, Alex said at one point, lifting his glass in the general direction of both of them. 5 years, Sera agreed. "Do you remember," Alex said to Nicholas, "that I told you not to screw it up?" "I remember. And you said you'd try not to." "I did." Alex looked at Sera. "How do you do?" She considered the question with genuine care, the way she considered things that deserved it. She thought about the first meeting with Vassos and the scrapes on Theo's hands, and the hospital shifts and the key on the breakfast table, and the ring in the December garden, and the morning in the kitchen at 4 a.m. when she'd told him something she'd been working up to for weeks. She thought about 5 years of choosing each other. Not perfectly. Not without argument. Not without the occasional night where she'd sat on the terrace alone working through something, and he'd sat in the operations wing working through it from his side. And then they'd found each other later and said the things that needed saying and continued. "He did well," she said. Alex raised his glass higher. Nicholas looked at her. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't thank me," she said. "You did the work." "We did the work." "Yes." She picked up her wine. "We did." Theo appeared at her elbow, having apparently concluded the narration at his end and requiring her presence for the next phase of the evening. He put his hand in hers with the casual, absolute trust of a child who has never had reason to doubt that the hand would be there. She held it. Nicholas put his hand over both of theirs. The garden was full and warm, and the light was doing the thing it did in May, over Athens golden and specific, and the kind of light that made things look as good as they were. Good, Theo said with the satisfied certainty of someone taking inventory and finding it complete. Sera looked at Nicholas over their son's head. He looked back. Yeah, she said, good. The evening continued. Dinner and noise and the ordinary beautiful chaos of people who loved each other occupying the same space, spilling into each other's stories, passing food and wine and opinions and laughter back and forth, with the ease of people who had been doing this long enough to have stopped thinking about it as a choice and started experiencing it as simply what life was. Later, after Theo was in bed and Alex had gone, Sera and Nicholas sat on the terrace, in the quiet that followed a good evening, the warm-used quiet of a house that had been fully occupied and was resting. Happy? She asked. Yes. He said it without qualification. You? Yes. She leaned her head against his shoulder, unreasonably so given everything. Not unreasonably, he said. We built it. We built it, she agreed. He pressed his lips to her hair. The city hummed beyond the garden wall. The wisteria stirred in the night air. Somewhere upstairs, Theo was asleep in his blue room, dreaming the confident dreams of a child who had always known that the people who loved him were exactly where they were supposed to be. Sera closed her eyes. She thought about a cold night in Kypseli, an apartment with thin walls, a phone she'd kept for 18 months without using. She thought about the specific quality of Theo's breathing when it was wrong, and the way fear had clarified everything, and the number she'd finally dialed. She thought I called because I had no choice. She thought I stayed because I chose to. She thought those are the two halves of everything. Everything she'd run from, everything she'd come back to. The fear that had sent her away and the love that had been there when she returned. Changed but continuous, the way rivers were continuous, even when you couldn't see where they went. She'd chosen it. Every day in 100 small ways, she still chose it. She opened her eyes. The garden was dark and warm. Nicholas was beside her. I'm glad, she said. Of what? All of it. She looked at the garden, the wisteria, the late stars beginning to show above the city's light. I'm glad it happened this way, the whole impossible, complicated way. He was quiet for a moment. Even the 18 months, he said. She thought about it honestly. Even then, she said, because it led here. He tightened his arm around her. Here is good, he said. She closed her eyes again. Here is very good, she said. The night held them. The island was 40 minutes away over the water. The wisteria had already decided where it was going next. The olive trees on Stavri had been standing for 100 years and intended to stand for 100 more. Theo was growing the way children grew faster than the days suggested, building himself out of everything around him, becoming more himself with each piece he added. And on a terrace in Kifisia, two people who had found each other through fear and distance and the specific courage of choosing differently than they had before, sat together in the warm dark and let themselves be where they were. Not running, not waiting, home. The morning Theo started second grade, Nicholas drove him. This was not in the grand tactical map of Nicholas Drakos' life, a significant operation. 2 streets, a school gate. A morning that happened every day for hundreds of thousands of children across Athens without requiring security assessments or route planning or any particular preparation beyond making sure a 7-year-old had his backpack. Petros had offered to drive. Nicholas had said no. He drove himself in a car that was not armored on streets that were not pre-cleared to a school gate where other parents stood with their own children in the morning light, the universal community of people who were in the middle of something irreplaceable and knew it. Theo had his new backpack. He'd chosen it himself. It was dark blue with a small yellow star on the side, selected after a thorough evaluation process that Nicholas had observed with the focused attention he gave to things Theo was taking seriously. They stood at the gate. Theo looked at the school with the expression of someone assessing a situation they had thought about considerably. Okay, Theo said. Okay, Nicholas agreed. Theo turned and looked at him with the direct, uncomplicated attention he'd had since he was 18 months old, in a crib, in the Constantine estate. The look that simply saw what was there without any of the distance people accumulated over years. You don't have to wait, Theo said. I know you're busy. Nicholas crouched down. "I'm not busy this morning," he said. Theo looked skeptical in the way that was so specifically his mother's that it sometimes startled Nicholas into a feeling he didn't have a complete word for. "You're always busy. I rearranged things." He met Theo's eyes. "I wanted to walk you in." Theo considered this. Then, "Okay." A pause. "You can wait until I find Phoebe." "I'll wait until you find Phoebe." They went in together, Theo moving with the purposeful stride of someone who knew where he was going and was pleased about it. Nicholas, a step behind. The classroom was already filling with children and their morning noise and the specific productive chaos of a school day beginning. Phoebe appeared from across the room and waved. Theo made a sound of satisfaction and looked back at Nicholas. "Found her," he said. "I see. You can go now." "I know." He put a hand briefly on Theo's shoulder. "Good day. You too," Theo said, already moving toward Phoebe, already being 7, already being himself. Nicholas stood in the doorway for a moment. He watched his son cross a classroom to find his friend watched him arrive and be met with the simple welcome of someone who had been expected. Watched the easy confidence of a child who had never been given reason to doubt that he was wanted in the places he went. He went back to the car. Sera was in the kitchen when he got home on her day off, reading something at the island with coffee. She looked up. "How was it?" she said. "Good." He set his keys on the table. He found Phoebe immediately. "He always does." She smiled. "How was it for you?" He looked at her. "I drove myself," he said. She understood what that meant. "I know, Petros told me." He seemed simultaneously concerned and proud, which I think is his natural state regarding you. Nicholas sat down at the table. "I stood at the gate," he said, "with the other parents." "And?" He was quiet for a moment. "It was good," he said. She pushed her coffee toward him. He took it. They sat at the table in the morning light of the Kifisia kitchen, and the house was quiet around them. And somewhere 2 streets away, Theo was starting his day in a classroom that didn't know anything about islands or security rotations, or a man learning year by year to be present without defending the presence. "You've come a long way," Sera said. "Not far enough," Nicholas said. "But further than I was. That's all it ever is." She reached across the table. He took her hand. "Further than you were." He held her hand and looked at the morning through the kitchen window and thought about all the versions of his life he might have had, the ones where the phone call never came, where Sera ran successfully and stayed gone, where he remained exactly what he'd been building himself into, complete, capable, utterly alone. He thought about the distance between those versions and this one. He thought worth it. All of it. Every complicated, imperfect, still unfinished step. Worth it. "Thank you," he said. "Not for any specific thing. For everything." "I know," she said in the same tone he'd used the first time she'd said it to him. He almost smiled. She did smile. The kitchen held them in the ordinary morning of their life. 2 people who had come to this through everything that should have prevented it, sitting at a table in a house with wisteria on the front wall and a blue room upstairs, holding hands in the specific, unremarkable, completely irreplaceable way of people who had figured out what mattered and had decided to stay. Outside, Athens went on. The olive trees on the island stood in the September light. 2 streets away, Theo was telling Phoebe something important about pulley systems and the structural requirements of second-grade architecture. And on the island and in Kifisia and in the long, complicated story of how they'd all found each other, the next part was already beginning, not dramatically. Not with announcements, but in the daily accumulation of choices made well enough of love, practiced honestly, of a family building itself piece by piece into something that would last. Not because it was perfect, because it was chosen every single day. That was how it worked. That was the whole of it. The last thing Sera thought about on the night of their 5th anniversary before she fell asleep on Nicholas's shoulder on the Kafija terrace was the apartment on Alcayo Street. She thought about it without grief now, without the cold sweat of the woman who had stood at a window at midnight counting the rise and fall of a child's chest, running calculations about ambulances and records and names, and the specific exhausting mathematics of a person who had been hiding for so long that the hiding had become indistinguishable from living. She thought about it the way you thought about a door you'd gone through, the way the door looked from the other side. She had been standing in that apartment with nothing except fear and a phone and the number she'd been keeping for 18 months, and she had made a choice. She had not known making it what the choice would produce. You never did. That was the whole thing, really. The whole of what she'd learned in 5 years of building this, that you never knew what the right choice would produce. You only knew what it cost to make it and what it cost not to. She had made the harder choice. She was still making it. It got easier every year. Not easier in the sense of requiring less of her, but easier in the sense of feeling less like effort and more like nature, like the person she'd always been underneath everything she'd needed to become to survive. She thought nearly herself now. The version of herself she'd been growing toward her whole career, her whole life, someone who ran toward things rather than from them, who held the range of outcomes and kept working, who understood that love was not a feeling you waited to be sure of, but a practice you committed to and refined. She was a trauma nurse. She knew that the hard cases weren't won by certainty. They were won by showing up and being good at the work and refusing to stop. That was marriage. That was family. That was this. Nicholas's arm was around her. The garden was dark and warm. The wisteria stirred. She was not afraid. She was home. She let herself be. The end. Postscriptum morning, 6 years later. Theo was 13. He was in the vocabulary his school reports reached for exceptional in analytical thinking and occasionally challenging in his certainty about outcomes. Alex read these reports and said they were the most accurate description of Nicholas he'd ever seen. Nicholas did not disagree. He was also kind. This was the thing about him that had surprised nobody who knew him and somehow still produced the quiet satisfaction of a quality confirmed rather than developed the specific kindness of a person who had been loved well and had learned by example what that looked like in practice. He had his father's eyes and his mother's mouth and a way of being in a room, present, attentive, undefended, that was entirely his own. On a Saturday in October, he came home from football practice. He'd been playing since he was 8 on a team with Phoebe and 4 other children from the neighborhood who had become something that was not quite family and not quite not family, and found his parents on the terrace with coffee. He dropped his kit by the door. He looked at them. "You're doing the thing," he said. "What thing?" Sera said. "The sitting together thing. Like you're having a moment." "We're having coffee," Nicholas said. Theo studied them with the skeptical precision he'd been deploying since he was 2. "You're also having a moment." "You can have coffee and a moment simultaneously," Sera said. Theo considered this. Then, fair. He went to the kitchen to find food in the manner of a 13-year-old returning from any kind of physical activity because the first order of business was always fuel. Nicholas looked at Sera. She looked at him. They were in fact having a moment, not a significant one. Not the kind that would later seem like a turning point, the kind that would be remembered and retold. Just the ordinary moment of 2 people looking at each other across a terrace on a Saturday. In October, their son audible in the kitchen assembling a substantial snack, the city humming beyond the garden wall, the afternoon light doing the thing it did in October over Athens, which was to make everything look like it had always been exactly what it was. "He's right," Nicholas said. "About what?" "We're having a moment," Sera smiled. "We have them all the time," she said. "I know." He looked at her. "I'm still not used to it." She reached out and tucked a piece of his hair back, a gesture she'd picked up years ago and performed now without thinking, the small, automatic intimacies of 2 people who had been sharing space long enough to move through it without inventory. "You don't have to be used to it," she said. "You just have to keep showing up." "Why?" He turned his hand over and held hers. "I can do that," he said. From the kitchen, the sound of Theo announcing something to nobody in particular about the structural problems with the way the snacks were organized. "He's going to reorganize the kitchen again," Nicholas said. "Yes," Sera agreed. "Let him. It takes an hour." "I know." She leaned back in her chair. "He gets it from you." "He gets the organizational certainty from me," Nicholas said. "He gets the willingness to actually do it from you." "That's generous?" "That's accurate." The kitchen fell briefly silent, which meant Theo had found what he was looking for and was now engaged with it. The terrace was warm and the afternoon was doing its October thing, and the wisteria had gone to its winter architecture again, the bare certain lines of something that would come back larger in spring. This was a Saturday in their life. One of hundreds of Saturdays. Ordinary and specific, and theirs accumulated into years, into a family, into the specific shape of 2 people who had figured out how to choose each other every day, and had been doing it long enough that the choosing had become the background hum of everything. The frequency you didn't notice because it was what the world was made of. They'd started with nothing but desperation and a phone call in the dark. They'd built this. It was by any measure enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. One final postscript, because some stories insist on it. The olive trees on Stavri were, as Vassos had observed and Theo had instinctively understood, patient. They had been standing on that island for over 100 years. They had outlasted everyone who had claimed to own them, and would outlast everyone who currently did. Theo had been visiting them his whole life. At 7, he had tried to climb them. At 10, he had learned to prune them properly with Petros's careful guidance and the specific satisfaction of a skill acquired through actual instruction rather than trial and error. At 13, he had started harvesting the olives in October, which was a job that required an entire weekend, and produced at the end of it approximately 30 kilograms of fruit that became oil that went into the kitchen of the Kifisia house and lasted, depending on the year, until approximately February. He did this every October. It was not negotiable. He had made this clear at age 11 and nobody had argued with him. Nicholas helped, not because he was needed. Theo and Petros had the system down, but because Theo had asked him once when he was 9 if Nicholas would come, and Nicholas had come, and then the next October, Theo had simply assumed he would come again. And Nicholas had found this assumption so precisely in line with everything he'd spent the last decade trying to become that he had never offered it the option of being wrong. It was objectively not glamorous work. It was standing under olive trees in October, pulling fruit off branches for 6 hours, then sorting and washing, then waiting the 3 weeks it took to process. It produced the best olive oil Nicholas had ever eaten. He had never told Theo this because it would produce an organizational certainty that would probably expand the harvest to the point of requiring a separate facility. He had told Sera. She had told him that was the correct decision, and also that she'd been eating it on bread every morning for 3 years, and agreed completely. "Don't tell him," Nicholas said. "I would never," she said. They told him on his 14th birthday. He immediately began planning for additional trees. This was Nicholas' thought as he watched his son present a proposal for an expanded grove with the confidence of someone who had done his research and expected the outcome to be favorable. Exactly right. It was exactly right. Everything about this was exactly right. Not because it was perfect, but because it was his theirs chosen built tended, allowed to grow in the direction it chose. Like the wisteria. Like everything that lasted. Like love. Which had been there when she called him in the dark, and had been there every morning since, and would be there patient as olive trees as long as they were.